Hey guys, tonight we are going to step back in time, not to a battlefield or a grand coronation, but into the fragile mind of a king. A king so powerful he could command armies, yet so fragile he was terrified of sitting down to fast. Honestly, if you were him, you'd probably have a nervous breakdown just trying to get out of bed, grappling with the sheer, crystalline anxiety of it all. It puts a new spin on the phrase walking on eggshells, doesn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and the time in the comments below. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're a courtier in late 14th century France. You're walking through the grand, cold halls of the Louvre, which back then was a royal palace. Not yet the museum packed with tourists and their selfie sticks. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, beeswax, and something else, a quiet, pervasive tension. You see him from a distance, the king, Charles VI. But HES not walking with the confident stride of a monarch. HES, gliding, moving with a bizarre, stilted grace, his arms held slightly away from his body, as if HES afraid to bump into the very air around him. A servant approaches him, bowing low, careful to stay at a respectful and physically safe distance. The king doesn't make eye contact. His gaze is fixed on a point in the middle distance, as if HES calculating the physics of his own existence with every single breath. You might think HES deep in thought about state affairs, perhaps a war with England or a new tax policy, but the truth is far, far stranger. The king is worried that if he moves too quickly, or if someone were to accidentally bump into him, he would shatter into a million tiny, glittering pieces. This, my friend, is your introduction to one of history's most peculiar and unnerving afflictions, the Glass Delusion. It's a genuine, documented psychiatric phenomenon where people, almost exclusively affluent men, became utterly convinced that their bodies were made of glass, and King Charles VI of France, later known to history as Charles the Mad, is our poster boy for this bizarre condition. His wasn't a fleeting, poetic metaphor about feeling fragile. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was anatomically composed of glass. The delusion dictated his entire existence. He refused to let people touch him. He would often remain standing for hours on end, or sit motionless, fearing that the simple act of sitting down would crack his delicate posture. It's a tough look for a monarch who's supposed to be the embodiment of national strength. It's hard to project power when you're worried a strong gust of wind might turn you into a pile of royal shards. To prevent this catastrophic shattering, he took extreme precautions. This is the kind of detail that sounds like it's from a fantasy novel, but it's historically recorded. He had special clothing designed, and we're not just talking about soft, fluffy fabrics. We're talking about clothes reinforced with iron rods and plates, sewn directly into the lining. Imagine wearing a cage under your royal silks. A personal, portable prison designed not to keep others out, but to keep your own glass body from breaking apart from within. He essentially turned himself into a human-shaped shipping crate for a precious, invisible vase. Now what could possibly make a powerful king think HES a piece of common glassware? That's the million flaw in question. For centuries, historians and medical experts have been trying to piece together the puzzle of Charles's mind. Was it a specific, horrifying trauma, a genetic predisposition to mental illness, or perhaps something else entirely, rooted in the very culture of the time? The truth is, historians still debate the precise origin and nature of Charles's mental illness. Some modern psychiatrists, looking back at the records, suggest it could have been a form of schizophrenia, or perhaps bipolar disorder with psychotic features, triggered by the immense pressures of kingship and a few terrifying life events that we will definitely get into. Others lean towards a more physiological explanation, like a brain injury from a high fever he suffered as a young man, or even a form of porphyria, a genetic disorder that can have neurological symptoms. We just don't have a time-traveling MRI machine to be certain. But for you, standing there in the cold stone hallway of the palace, the diagnosis doesn't matter. What you see is the raw, baffling reality of it. You, Sir King, a man who holds the fate of a nation in his hands, living in a state of constant, paralyzing fear of his own physical fall. This is the great, tragic irony at the heart of the Glass Delusion. The men who suffered from it were often the ones with the most earthly power, kings, nobles, wealthy scholars. They were at the very top of the social ladder, yet, in their own minds, they were as fragile as a Venetian goblet, one clumsy move away from being swept into a dustpan. The whispers in the court follow him like a shadow. How do you advise a king who thinks that he is made of glass? How do you pledge allegiance to a man who won't let you near him? It's a political crisis wrapped in a psychological enigma. His affliction wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a problem for the entire kingdom of France. And as you watch him slowly, carefully, navigate his way down the corridor, you can't help but wonder what it must be like inside that head. A prison of glass, where the warden and the prisoner are one and the same. So you're left wondering how a man, a king no less, gets to a point where he believes his own bones and flesh are as brittle as a window pane. It doesn't happen overnight. They mind, even a royal one, doesn't just snap. It usually cracks first, under immense pressure or after a profound shock. For King Charles VI, we can point to one specific night of pure, unadulterated horror. A night that reads like a cautionary tale written by a madman. Let's rewind a little, to the year 1393, just before the Glass Delusion fully took hold. The court is celebrating. One of the Queen's favorite ladies-in-waiting is getting married for the third time, which, back then, was apparently reason enough for a massive party. You can just picture the scene: music, dancing, wine flowing freely. It's a moment of levity in a court that's often stiff and formal. And the king, young and still relatively sound of mind, decides to contribute to the evening's entertainment with a little prank. He and 5 of his closest companions, all young, boisterous noblemen, come up with a truly terrible idea. They decide to dress up as wild men of the woods. This was a fairly common trope in medieval festivals. These mythical, hairy savages who lived outside the bounds of civilization. It was meant to be a thrilling, slightly scary surprise for the party guests. To achieve the look, they created costumes that were, in hindsight, a complete disaster. They were sewn into tight-fitting linen suits, which were then coated in a thick, sticky layer of resin or pitch. While the pitch was still wet, they rolled around in feathers and frayed hemp, making them look shaggy and beastly. To complete the illusion, they were chained together. Remember that detail. It's important. The plan was to burst into the banquet hall, howl and dance around like wild animals, and let the guests try to guess who they were. A bit of harmless fun, right? 6 of the most powerful men in France, disguised as monsters. Their identity is hidden, creating a delightful little chaos. They enter the hall, and the plan works perfectly. The guests are startled, some are laughing, some are shrieking in mock terror. The wild men lumber and dance, chained together, a single writhing creature of pitch and hair. The king is among them, completely anonymous. For a moment, it's all going according to plan. Then, the king's younger brother, Louis, the Duke of Orleans, arrives late with his friend, the Duke of Bar. They are, to put it mildly, drunk, and they are carrying lit torches to see their way through the crowded hall. They miss the memo about the surprise performance and are curious about these strange, hairy beasts captivating the court. They stumble forward, peering closely, trying to identify the dancers. One of them, in a moment of catastrophic, wine-fueled stupidity, brings his torch too close to one of the costumes. Pitch, hint, feathers. It all went up in an instant. The fire didn't just catch, it exploded. One of the men was immediately engulfed in a column of flame, and because they were all chained together, the fire lit from man to man in a matter of seconds. The scene turned from a party to an inferno. The screams of the burning men were drowned out only by the screams of the horrified onlookers. They were wrapped, not just in their flammable costumes, but by the very chains meant to unite them in their prank. This is where the king got incredibly, astonishingly lucky. He had moved a bit away from the main group to playfully frighten some of the ladies. A quick-thinking, uncourageous 15-year-old, the Duchess of Berry, recognized him without a second's hesitation. She threw the massive skirt of her gown over him, smothering sparks that had begun to lick at his costume and shielding him from the main blaze. She saved his life. Another of the dancers, in a moment of sheer desperation, managed to break free and threw himself into a giant vat of dishwater in the kitchens, extinguishing the flames. The other four were not so fortunate. They burned for what must have felt like an eternity. To died on the spot, to others endured unimaginable agony for days before succumbing to their wounds. This event became known as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. The name alone is a testament to its horror. The entire court, the entire nation of France, was plunged into shock and mourning, and the king, Charles, was at the center of it all. He had not only witnessed the horrific deaths of his closest friends, but he had narrowly, almost miraculously, escaped the same fate. The psychological fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The guilt must have been unbearable. It was his idea, his prank. He survived while his friends perished in the most gruesome way imaginable. This is the kind of trauma that reshapes a person's reality. And historians and psychologists still debate whether the Ball of the Burning Men was the sole cause of his descent into madness, or merely the tipping point for a mind already predisposed to illness. Some argue the event itself was so profoundly traumatic, it could have induced a form of PTSD that spiraled into psychosis. Others believe he already had an underlying condition, and this horror was simply the trigger that unleashed its full, devastating potential. What we do know is that, after this night, his lucid periods became shorter and his psychotic episodes more frequent and more severe. It's not hard to draw a line from the trauma of the fire to his later delusion. Think about it. He saw his friends, his own flesh and blood companions, become bristle and burn away. He felt the heat, he heard the screams, he smelled the smoke. In that moment of terror, his own body must have felt impossibly vulnerable, as fragile as kindling. Perhaps, in the shattered logic of his traumatized mind, the only way to make sense of that vulnerability was to imagine himself as something else entirely, something so fragile, so transparent, so easily broken that it required constant, obsessive protection. Something like glass. The fire didn't just burn his friends, it seems to have seared a crack straight through the king's own psyche. So, the King of France now believes he's a walk-in, talking piece of crystal. This isn't just a quirky personality trait he can hide away. This is a full-blown, life-altering delusion that requires a complete restructuring of his daily routine. You can't just go about your kingly duties signing edicts, meeting ambassadors, leading armies when you're convinced a firm handshake might shatter your arm. The palace had to adapt, and fast. The result was a bizarre series of precautions that turned the court into a high-stakes, slow-motion ballet of anxiety. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of his self-preservation measures, because this is where the historical accounts get both tragic and slightly absurd. We mentioned the iron-reinforced clothing. This wasn't just a rumor, it's a detail that pops up in chronicles of the time. Imagine the royal tailor getting that particular commission. Your Majesty, the arm and trim is ready. But a quick question, would you prefer the steel rods on the inside or the outside of the double this season? It sounds like a joke. But for Charles, it was a deadly serious matter of structural integrity. He was essentially wearing an external skeleton to protect his fragile, glossy interior. This made his movement stiff and cumbersome, adding a physical manifestation to his mental prison. He clenched. The King of France clenched when he walked. But the protection didn't stop with his wardrobe. The real challenge was mobility. The world, to Charles, was a minefield of hard surfaces and unpredictable movements. His greatest enemy, the chair. The simple act of sitting down became a moment of existential dread. He was terrified that the pressure and impact, no matter how gentle, would cause his glass buttocks to crack. This is, by the way, a surprisingly common theme among Glass Delusion sufferers. A number of them were specifically fixated on their posteriors. We'll meet a scholar later who had the exact same problem. To combat this, Charles would often refuse to sit at all, remaining standing for hours during council meetings, much to the discomfort of his courtiers who were obliged to stand with him when he absolutely had to sit. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver. He would have special, large, soft cushions placed on his throne, not just for comfort, but as a shock absorber. But even that wasn't enough. He often had servants place additional pillows and thick layers of straw on his seat, creating a veritable nest for the royal rear. There's a strange poignancy in the image of a king, surrounded by luxury and power, needing to be buffered by something as humble as straw, the stuff of stables and peasant mattresses. His sphere extended to people as well. The bustling court, with its constant traffic of nobles, servants, and petitioners, became a source of immense anxiety. He ordered that no one should touch him, ever. Attendants were trained to dress him, feed him, and assist him without making direct physical contact, a feat of dexterity and nerve. When he moved through the palace, he would often have guards walk ahead of him, clearing a wide path, not for security in the traditional sense, but to create a buffer zone, a personal bubble of safety to prevent any accidental, shattering bumps. The royal don't touch me policy was absolute. His bed, a place of rest for most, became another zone of meticulously managed risk. It had to be soft, tuck and light, but he was also terrified of crashing in his sleep and breaking himself. Historians suggest he may have had barriers or cushions arranged around him in bed, essentially swaddling himself like a fragile infant. The king, tucked into his fortress of pillows. Now for a little known, and frankly quite sad, detail about his condition. According to the contemporary writer N. N.D. Demonstralet, during some of his worst episodes, Charles would run wildly through the halls of his own palace until he was utterly exhausted. This manic energy, a stark contrast to his usual stiff and careful movements, suggests the immense turmoil within him. He was trapped between two extremes of terror-induced paralysis and a frenzied, desperate need to escape his own skin. It's almost as if he was testing the limits of his glassy form, half expecting to shatter and half hoping for the release it might bring. And after these fits, he would sometimes fail to recognize his own wife and children. He would forget his own name. He was not Charles. He was simply a man made of glass. This creates a fundamental question that historians and medical experts are still puzzling over. Was he in a constant state of delusion? Or did it come in waves? The chronicles seem to suggest the latter. He had periods of lucidity, moments where the glass identity would recede, and he would be the king again, albeit a weary and haunted one. He would express immense grief and remorse for his actions and his condition during these same intervals. He even tried to govern, to make decisions for his kingdom. But the shadow of the glass was always there, waiting to fall again. This fluctuation made things even more difficult for his council. Who was in charge today, the competent King Charles, or the fragile glass man who couldn't be touched? It was a political nightmare. Imagine trying to get a treaty signed, but having to wait because the king was having a glass day and was currently hiding in a corner, convinced the inkwell was a potential weapon. The Palace of the Louvre, therefore, became a strange and surreal environment. It was a place of immense power, but it operated on the whims of its monarch's fragile psyche. The rustle of a silken sleeve, a courtier stumbling on a loose floorboard, a door slamming in the wind, any sudden sound or movement could send a ripple of fear through the court. As all eyes turned to the king, watching and waiting to see if this was the moment he would finally break. Living with a glass king wasn't just a personal family drama, it was a national crisis playing out in slow motion. The entire ecosystem of the French court had to revolve around his delusion. This wasn't like having a monarch with a limp or a bad temper. This was a fundamental breakdown of the central pillar of the state, the king, who was supposed to be God's anointed representative on earth. Strong, decisive, and solid, was, in his own mind, as brittle as a church window. So how did the powerful people around him, his wife, his brother, his dukes, and his counselors actually cope with this? Well, the answer is a very human mix of concern, frustration, and, of course, political opportunism. First, you have the Queen, Isabel of Bavaria. Her situation was incredibly difficult. She was married to a man who, during his episode, didn't recognize her and couldn't bear to be touched by her. The chronicles tell us that during his worst spells, she was often moved to a separate residence for her own safety and peace of mind. But she was also the mother of his children, including the heir to the throne. Her primary role was to ensure stability and the continuation of the dynasty, so she played a careful game. She became a key figure in the Regency Council that governed in the king's name during his incapacities. She was trying to hold the kingdom together while its king was mentally falling apart. Then you have the king's relatives, the powerful dukes, often referred to as the princes of the blood. This is where things get messy. The two main players were the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, and his uncle, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. With the king effectively absent from power for long stretches, a vacuum opened up, and as we know from both history and basic physics, a power vacuum abhors being empty. Louis and Philip immediately began a bitter struggle to fill it. They weren't just fighting for influence, they were fighting for control of France itself. Every time the king had a lucid moment, he would try to reassert his authority. He might favor his brother in one decision, and his uncle in another. But as soon as he relapsed into his glass-like state, the gloves would come off. The dukes would issue edicts in his name, raise taxes, and appoint their own loyalists to key positions, all while claiming they were acting in the best interests of the poor, incapacitated king. The king's illness became their political playground. His fragility became their strength. You as a courtier would have to navigate this treacherous landscape. Who do you show loyalty to? The king, who might not even remember your name tomorrow, or one of the powerful dukes, who could make or break your career? Siding with Orleans might get you a lucrative post, but it would make you an enemy of the formidable Duke of Burgundy, and vice versa. The court became a nest of factions and conspiracies, with everyone whispering behind tapestries, trying to guess which way the political wind would blow next. The king's delusion wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was the engine of political chaos. But what about managing the king himself? They couldn't just lock him away. He was still the king. So they tried to humor him, to work within the framework of his delusion. If the king believed he was made of glass, then everyone had to act like he was made of glass. This led to some truly strange displays of political theater. Imagine a council meeting where a weighty issue of state is being debated, but everyone is speaking in hushed tones and moving with exaggerated care, lest they startle the monarch and cause a shattering incident. It must have felt like living in a permanent, high-stakes pantomime. Here's a bizarre, lesser-known detail that illustrates the court's predicament. During his illness, the king's personal hygiene suffered immensely. He would refuse to bathe or change his clothes for months on end. According to one chronicler, he was eventually infested with lice and covered in sores. His attendants, bound by his do-not-touch rule, were helpless. Finally, in a moment of sheer desperation, the council devised a plan. They hired a group of men, disguised them in black, and had them burst into the king's chambers. They pretended to be demons who were there to attack him. In the ensuing struggle, they forcibly held him down, stripped him of his filthy clothes, and gave him a much-needed bath. They used fear to break through the paralysis of his delusion. A shocking but apparently effective last resort. And this raises a question that historians still ponder: to what extent did the court enable his delusion versus trying to cure it? There's a fine line between compassionate care and political convenience. On one hand, accommodating his belief that he was glass was perhaps the only way to keep him calm and prevent him from harming himself. It was a coping mechanism for the entire court. On the other hand, by constantly reinforcing the delusion by moving carefully around him, by providing the straw cushions, by never challenging his bizarre reality were they inadvertently trapping him deeper inside it, it's possible that for some, like the rival dukes, a glass king was more politically useful than a healthy one. A fragile king was a manageable king, one whose power could be easily siphoned off. So the whispers in the palace halls weren't just gossip. They were the sound of a kingdom holding its breath. Courtiers traded stories of the king's latest strange behavior, not just for amusement, but as vital political intelligence. Did he speak today? Did he recognize the queen? Did he ask for his iron-enforced waistcoat? Every detail was a clue to the state of his mind, and therefore, the state of the nation. You learned to read the king's madness like a weather report, trying to predict the political storms that were sure to follow. In the court of Charles the Mad, survival depended on knowing just how fragile the man on the throne truly felt. So you have a king who thinks a chaos made of glass, a court walking on eggshells, and a government in turmoil. The next logical question is, what did the doctors think in an age before psychiatry, before brain scans, before any real understanding of mental illness? How did the most learned medical minds of the 15th century explain this? The answer lies in a theory that dominated Western medicine for over 2,000 years, the four humors. To understand their approach, you have to temporarily forget everything you know about modern medicine. Forget germs, forget genetics, forget brain chemistry. Instead, picture the human body as a container filled with four distinct fluids, or humors. These were black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. According to this ancient theory, inherited from the Greeks like Hippocrates and Galen, a person's health, personality, and mood were all determined by the balance of these four liquids. If you had a perfect balance, you were healthy and even-tempered. But if one of the humors became excessive or depleted, you were in trouble. Too much blood made you sanguine, that is, cheerful, optimistic, and a bit flushed. Too much phlegm made you phlegmatic, calm, slow, and perhaps a little lazy. Too much yellow bile made you choleric, fiery, ambitious, and quick to anger. And then there was the tricky one, black bile. An excess of black bile, or melancholia, was believed to be the root of sadness, fear, and depression. It was considered a cold, heavy, dark substance that literally weighed down the spirit. When a medieval or Renaissance doctor saw a patient suffering from what we would now call clinical depression or a severe anxiety disorder, their first thought wasn't serotonin levels. It was, oh, too much black bile. The patient was suffering from melancholy. So when King Charles and other nobles started showing up with this bizarre glass delusion, the physicians of the day reached for the only diagnostic tool they had. They saw a man consumed by fear, living in a state of constant, anxious paralysis. They saw a man who was withdrawn, isolated, and plagued by dark thoughts. To them, this was a textbook case, albeit a very strange one, of extreme melancholy. The black bile in his system had become so potent, so overwhelmingly cold and dry in its properties, that it had managed to completely warp his perception of reality. The logic, from their perspective, was surprisingly consistent. What are the properties of black bile? It's dark, heavy, and associated with the element of earth, but in its most extreme, corrupted form. They imagined it could take on a different quality. Just as heating some earth in a furnace can create glass, they reasoned that an excess of burnt, adest black bile in the body could metaphorically cook the person's spirit, transforming their self-perception into something brittle, dark, and transparent, like smoked glass. It was a physical explanation for a mental problem. His mind wasn't broken, his internal fluids were just out of whack. This leads to a fascinating and slightly gross bit of trivia. How did they diagnose an excess of black bile? Well, they didn't have blood tests, but they did have the patient's output. Physicians would meticulously inspect the patient's urine, feces, and sometimes even their sweat and saliva. They would study the color, consistency, and smell, looking for telltale signs of which humor was dominant. For a melancholic, they would be looking for dark, thick urine or other signs that the body was trying to expel this excess black bile. It was a messy, hands-on approach to diagnostics. The treatment, therefore, was not therapy or medication in our sense, but a project of rebalancing the humors. The goal was to purge the excess black bile and restore warmth and moisture to the king's cold and dry system. This involved a whole menu of unpleasant interventions. They prescribed special diets, recommending warm and moist foods like chicken, lamb, and wine, while forbidding cold and dry foods like beef or certain vegetables. They would encourage hot baths, hoping to literally warm the king up and sweat out the noxious humor. And then there were the more aggressive treatments. Bloodletting was a go-to procedure for almost everything. The logic was that by removing some of the patient's blood, you could also remove the excess humors mixed in with it. So, the king likely had to endure being bled, having a vein opened and a prescribed amount of his unbalanced blood drained away, a process that probably just left him weaker and more anemic. They also used purgatives and emetics, powerful laxatives and substances that induce vomiting to force the body to expel the corrupt bile from his digestive system. Imagine being terrified of shattering, and then being given a medicine that causes violent muscle contraction. It's a miracle the treatments themselves didn't cause a complete nervous breakdown. But here's where we find a fascinating point of debate among medical historians. Did the doctors of the time truly believe this was just a case of melancholy, or did they recognize it as something stranger? Something that pushed the boundaries of their medical framework. Some scholars argue that by labeling it melancholy, they were simply fitting a bar's new symptom into the only category they had. It was a diagnosis of convenience. Others suggest that the very existence of the glass delusion forced some physicians to think more deeply. Figures like the pioneering physician Felix Plater, who documented such cases, were starting to catalog mental illnesses with a new level of detail, hinting at a growing awareness that not all madness could be neatly explained by a simple imbalance of fluids. They were witnessing a condition so specific and so strange that it challenged the universal applicability of the four humors theory, even if they couldn't fully break away from it. So when the royal physicians conferred in hushed tones in the palace corridors, they weren't discussing psychology, they were discussing alchemy. The king's body was a vessel, a crucible, and the black bile was the volatile substance that had turned toxic. Their job was to be alchemists of the flesh, to purify the king's internal humors and, they hoped, transform his mind of glass back into a mind of flesh and blood. It was a noble goal, but their tools were crude, their understanding was limited, and the king's suffering continued. So we have a king made of glass, and we have doctors blaming it on an excess of burnt black bile. But here's the really weird part: King Charles VI wasn't alone. As the 15th and 16th centuries wore on, the Glass Delusion started popping up across Europe. It was never a full-blown epidemic like the plague, but it became a recurring, albeit rare, psychiatric phenomenon, and it had a very specific demographic. The victims were almost always men, and not just any men. They were overwhelmingly aristocrats, wealthy merchants, and, most tellingly, scholars. This wasn't a disease of the common farmer or the simple craftsman. You don't find records of blacksmiths worried about shattering their glass arms while hammering a horseshoe. This was, for lack of a better term, a luxury madness. It was an affliction of the elite. And this very fact gives us a huge clue about what might have been going on. The glass delusion wasn't just a random psychological tic, it was deeply intertwined with class, status, and the intellectual culture of the time. It became, in a strange way, a fashionable disease. Why would this be? Let's go back to our friend, black bile. In the Renaissance worldview, melancholy wasn't all bad. While extreme melancholy could lead to debilitating madness, a touch of it was seen as a mark of intellectual and spiritual depth. The melancholic temperament, linked to the planet Saturn, was associated with genius, creativity, and profound thought. the scholar, hunched over his books, the contemplative poet, the introspective artist. These were all seen as classic melancholic types. To be melancholic was to be sensitive, intelligent, and prone to deep philosophical insights. It set you apart from the happy-go-lucky, unthinking masses. So if you were a nobleman or a scholar who was feeling anxious or depressed, having your condition diagnosed as melancholy wasn't entirely a bad thing. It framed your suffering in a way that was almost prestigious. It meant you weren't just sad, you were intellectually and spiritually refined. Your mind was simply too delicate for this coarse world. And what could be a more potent, more literal metaphor for a delicate and refined mind than believing you were made of glass? This delusion was the ultimate expression of elite fragility. It was a way of saying, I am not like other men. I am complex. I am fragile. I am translucent. It was a physical manifestation of the sensitive soul stereotype. In an era where nobles were increasingly defined not just by their military prowess but by their education and refinement, the glass delusion became a bizarre sort of status symbol. It was a sickness. Yes, but it was a sophisticated sickness. Think about the life of a scholar during this period. They were a new kind of intellectual force. They spent their days indoors, surrounded by books, living a sedentary life of the mind. Their bodies were, in a sense, secondary to their intellects. This was a stark contrast to the traditional aristocratic ideal of the hardy knight, whose body was a weapon and whose life was one of physical action. This new class of thinkers was physically inactive but mentally hyperactive. Their entire world was one of abstract thought and intense study. Historians of culture and medicine often debate whether this sedentary, intellectually focused lifestyle was a direct cause of the delusion. Did spending all day in a quiet study, poring over ancient texts, make one more prone to this kind of introspective, body-focused anxiety? It's a compelling idea. The body, unused and untested by physical labor, becomes a strange and alien object, something that can be reimagined as a fragile, artificial substance. And let's not forget the sheer pressure. A scholar's reputation depended on his intellectual brilliance. A nobleman's status depended on his political maneuvering and social grace. These were high-stakes environments where a single misstep could lead to ruin. The intense mental strain of this life could easily curdle into paranoia and anxiety. Believing you are made of glass is, in a way, the perfect metaphor for the feeling that you are under constant scrutiny and that one false move could shatter your reputation and social standing. We have a fascinating, and slightly funny, tidbit that illustrates this class-based nature of the illness perfectly. In one medical text from the period, a doctor described treating a woman from a lower social class who also believed she was made of glass. But instead of being made of fine, clear Venetian glass like the nobleman, she was convinced she was made of a much cruder, cheaper material, an earthenware pot. Even in their delusions, people seemed to stick to their social station. Your imagined material reflected your place in the world. So while the suffering of these glass men was undoubtedly real and terrifying for them, it's impossible to separate it from the cultural context. The glass delusion was a product of its time, a culture-bound syndrome, as modern anthropologists would call it. It was a specific way of experiencing and expressing distress that made sense within the intellectual and social framework of Renaissance Europe. It tapped into prevailing ideas about melancholy, genius, and the fragility of the refined mind. It was a performance of suffering, albeit an unconscious one. It was a way for these powerful, intelligent men to articulate a profound sense of vulnerability in a world that demanded they be strong. To be made of glass was to be special. It was a terrible, frightening curse, but it was a curse reserved for the best and brightest. And so, for a couple of 100 years, if you were going to have a mental breakdown, this was the fashionable way to do it. So we've established that the glass delusion was a condition of the elite, tied up with ideas of melancholy and intellectual fragility. But this still leaves a very basic question unanswered: why glass of all the materials in the world? Why did these men fixate on this specific substance? Why not believe they were made of wood, or paper, or ice? The answer is that in the 15th and 16th centuries, Glass wasn't just another material. It was a substance of immense technological wonder, symbolic power, and almost magical prestige. For most of human history, glass was incredibly rare and fantastically expensive. In the ancient world, it was a luxury on par with precious gems. But by the late Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance, things were beginning to change, largely thanks to the master craftsmen of Venice. The island of Murano, in the Venetian lagoon, became the world capital of glassmaking. The Venetian Republic guarded its glassmaking secrets so jealously that any glassmaker who tried to leave and take their skills elsewhere could be hunted down and assassinated. This wasn't just industry, it was a state secret of immense value. As a result, Venetian cristallo clear, brilliant, and flawless type of glass was one of the most coveted luxury goods in all of Europe. Kings, popes, and wealthy merchants paid fortunes for Venetian mirrors, goblets, and chandeliers. Owning fine glass was a definitive statement of wealth and sophistication. It was the tech gadget of its day. When you held a perfectly clear Venetian wine glass, you were holding something that felt almost supernatural. It was solid, yet you could see right through it. It was rigid and strong, yet incredibly fragile. It captured and played with light in a way no other man-made material could. So, for a nobleman or a wealthy scholar, glass was a substance they encountered in their daily lives, but only in contexts of extreme value and refinement. It was the material of their finest drinking vessels. Their most expensive windows a huge luxury at the time, and their precious mirrors. Glass was associated with clarity, purity, and a kind of ethereal beauty. To imagine oneself as made of glass wasn't to imagine oneself as a common beer bottle. It was to imagine oneself as a priceless work of art, a Venetian masterpiece. It elevated the delusion, giving it a certain poetic, aristocratic quality. But the significance of glass went even deeper, into the realms of science and philosophy. This was the era when glass was revolutionizing how people saw the world literally. The invention of spectacles, made with ground glass lenses, was a game changer. For the first time, scholars whose eyesight was failing could continue their studies into old age. The glass lens was a tool that corrected a flaw in the human body, enhancing a natural sense. This created a powerful link between glass and the intellect. Glass was what allowed the mind to perceive the world more clearly. Then you had the rise of alchemy. The alchemist's laboratory was a forest of glass. Glass retorts, alembics, and beakers were essential for the great work of transmutation. Why? Because glass was seen as a pure and incorruptible material. You could heat it. You could boil strange concoctions in it, and it wouldn't react with the substances inside. It was a neutral, transparent vessel that allowed the alchemist to observe the secret processes of transformation without interfering with them. The glass container was the window into the secrets of matter. Given this context, it's not such a leap for a melancholic scholar, obsessed with the inner workings of his own body and soul, to begin to see himself as an alchemical vessel. His body was the fragile container, and his soul or spirit was the precious substance being transformed within. The transparency of glass also resonated with the philosophical and religious ideas of the time. There was a desire for inner clarity, for a pure heart, for the soul to be transparent before God. To be made of glass could be a terrifying physical state, but it carried a powerful metaphorical weight of spiritual purity and self-awareness. You were so self-aware, so introspective, that your very body had become transparent. Here's a little-known fact that highlights the almost magical status of glass. Some people believed that a fine Venetian goblet would spontaneously shatter if poison were poured into it. This was a widespread belief among the nobility, who lived in constant fear of assassination. A glass goblet wasn't just a cup, it was a personal security device. This imbues glass with a sense of moral agency, a connection to purity and danger. The idea that glass could detect and react to corruption in the outside world makes it easier to imagine one's own glass body being impossibly sensitive to the moral and physical threats around it. So while we often think of the glass delusion as a purely psychological phenomenon, historians of science and technology argue that you cannot understand it without understanding the material science of the era. The delusion didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was a direct response to a wonder material that was reshaping science, art, and luxury. The very properties that made glass so revolutionary: its transparency, its fragility, its purity, its value were the same properties that the sufferers internalized and projected onto their own bodies. They weren't just mentally ill, they were mentally ill in a way that was profoundly modern for their time. They were grappling with the implications of a new technology, a new way of seeing on being. The glass that was allowing them to see the world more clearly through telescopes and microscopes was also, in their minds, the very substance of their own fragile existence. They saw themselves reflected in the era's most dazzling and dangerous material. All right, so you're a 16th century physician. A wealthy nobleman walks into your office very slowly and tells you he's made of glass. After you've checked his humors and confirmed he's suffering from a severe case of melancholy. Your next job is to actually treat him. But how do you cure a man who believes he's a walking, talking chandelier? You can't just tell him he's wrong. A delusion, by its nature, is a fixed, unshakable belief. Arguing with him would be like arguing with a wall, a very fragile, anxious wall. So the doctors of the era had to get creative. Their treatments were a fascinating, and sometimes alarming, blend of humoral theory, rudimentary psychology, and pure theatrical improvisation. Since they couldn't fix the glass body, they often tried to fix the black bile that was supposedly causing the problem. This meant all the standard melancholic treatments we've touched on: bloodletting, purges, and special diets. But for a condition this specific, they often devised more tailored, psychological approaches. Many doctors subscribed to a like cures like philosophy. If the problem was a delusion, maybe the cure was a bigger, more convincing delusion. It was a kind of proto-cognitive behavioral therapy, but with way more props and a higher risk of backfiring spectacularly. One of the most famous and frankly bizarre examples comes from the French physician André du Laurens. He tells the story of a nobleman who believed his buttocks were made of glass and therefore refused to ever sit down. The man was wasting away, exhausted from being on his feet all the time. Argument and reason had failed, so his doctor devised a cunning, if rather violent, plan. Without warning, the doctor had the manservant sneak up behind him and give him a sound thrashing on his supposedly glass posterior. The man, shocked and outraged, immediately began yelling about the pain. The doctor then triumphantly pointed out, "So, if your buttocks were made of glass, they would have shattered into 1,000 pieces. But they are not broken, they merely hurt. This proves they are made of flesh and blood." The shock of the physical assault, combined with this irrefutable and rather sore evidence, apparently snapped the man out of his delusion. It's a bit like fixing a glitchy computer by smacking it on the side. Crude, but sometimes effective. Another physician, a bit more of a showman, took a different approach. He was treating a patient who was also convinced he was made of glass. The doctor didn't argue. He agreed. He said, "You are absolutely right. You are made of the most delicate glass. And this is a terrible problem, because glass is useless until it has been tempered by fire." He then informed the terrified patient that the only cure was to be fired in a kiln, just like a real glass vessel, to make him strong and durable. He had a massive pile of straw and kindling brought into the room and made a great show of preparing to set it alight around the patient. The patient, faced with the prospect of being literally roasted alive, was suddenly cured. He leapt up, screaming that he was not made of glass after all, and ran for his life. The fear of being burned was greater than the fear of being shattered. This kind of psychological trickery was a common theme. One famous story, recounted by the scholar Robert Burton, involves a man who believed he would shatter if he urinated. He was in agony, his bladder near bursting. His physician, again, played along, The doctors secretly arranged for a servant to smash a glass vessel in the next room at the precise moment the patient finally, inevitably, relieved himself. The patient heard the crash, assumed it was the sound of his own body shattering, and then, realizing he was still in one piece, was freed from his fear. Here's a lesser-known but equally clever therapeutic trick. One doctor treated a glass man by wrapping him from head to toe in an enormous amount of leather padding and blankets. He then had servants gently and repeatedly bump into the patient. At first, the patient was terrified, but after being bumped dozens of times with no ill effects, his confidence slowly grew. The padding acted as a physical buffer, but also as a psychological one. It was a form of gradual exposure therapy, allowing the patient to test his fear in a controlled, safe environment. He was essentially being taught, through experience, that the world wasn't as dangerous as his mind was telling him. Of course, the effectiveness of these theatrical cures is a major point of contention for medical historians. Did they really work as well as the doctors who wrote about them claimed, or were these accounts exaggerated? A form of self-promotion to make the physician look like a genius? It's likely a bit of both. The stories we have are the success stories. We don't have the case files of the patients who were simply thrashed and remained just as delusional. Only now they were also bruised. Furthermore, a sudden cure brought on by terror might not be a permanent one. The underlying anxiety and melancholy that caused the delusion in the first place were probably still there, waiting to manifest in a new and different way. What these strange treatments show us, however, is a medical community grappling with the mind-body problem in a very direct way. They couldn't separate the physical from the psychological. To them, a mental delusion required a physical intervention. Whether it was draining the body of blood by law, providing the sensory shock of a sudden blow, or the threat of fire, they were trying to reset the mind by rebooting the body. It was a medicine of shocks and spectacles. A far cry from the quiet conversations of a modern therapist's office. But in a world where a king could believe he was a crystal goblet, perhaps only the most dramatic and outlandish cures stood a chance of being heard above the noise of the delusion itself. While the physicians were busy with their theatrical cures and humoral theories, another group of intellectuals was looking at the human body in a completely different, and much more direct, way: the anatomists. The Renaissance was the great age of anatomical discovery. Thinkers like Andreas Vesalius were challenging centuries of received wisdom by doing something revolutionary. They were actually looking inside the human body. This was a radical shift. For 1,000 years, European medicine had been dominated by the texts of ancient authorities like Galen. Galen was a brilliant physician, but he based most of his human anatomy on dissections of animals, like pigs and Barbary apes, because human dissection was largely taboo. Renaissance anatomists, however, began to systematically dissect human cadavers, often in grand public demonstrations and specially built anatomical theaters. They were creating the first truly accurate maps of the human body. So you have this incredible collision of worldviews happening in the same cities. At the same time, in one room, you have a scholar with the Glass Delusion, experiencing his body as a fragile, transparent, and homogeneous substance. In another room, just down the street, you have an anatomist like Vesalius, surrounded by his students, carefully peeling back the layers of a human corpse and revealing a world of breathtaking complexity: sinews, muscles, organs, bones, all intricately woven together. The anatomists were proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the human body was not made of glass. It was a machine of flesh and blood, of fibers and fluids. Vesalius's groundbreaking 1543 book, De Human Corporis Fabricae, and the fabric of the human body, was filled with stunningly detailed illustrations showing the true structure of the human form. An educated man of the time, even one suffering from the Glass Delusion, would likely have been aware of these new discoveries. He might have even seen the illustrations. And yet, it didn't help. This is the great paradox at the heart of the delusion. You could show a glass man a detailed anatomical drawing of a human femur. You could explain the tensile strength of bone. You could even in theory take him to a public dissection and show him the real thing. But the delusion would remain. The sufferer's internal, subjective reality was more powerful and more convincing than any external, objective proof. This created a profound sense of frustration for the more scientifically minded physicians of the day. They were armed with brand new, verifiable knowledge about the body, but it was utterly useless against the power of a sick mind. The Dutch physician Levinus Lemnius wrote about this in the 16th century, expressing his bewilderment at patients who, despite all evidence to the contrary, clung to their bizarre beliefs. He described a man who thought he had frogs living in his belly, and no amount of logical argument could persuade him otherwise. The glass delusion was an even more extreme example of this disconnect between perception and reality. Here's a small, specific detail that highlights this conflict. Anatomists were particularly proud of their work on the human skeleton. They were the first to accurately count and depict all 206 bones. To them, the skeleton was the very symbol of human strength and structure, the solid framework upon which the entire body was built. For a glass man, however, his internal framework was the very source of his fragility. He imagined his bones not as strong, calcium-rich structures, but as brittle glass rods. It's a complete inversion of the anatomical truth. The very thing that science saw as a source of strength, the delusion saw as the locus of weakness. And this is where we encounter a debate that has echoed down the centuries and still exists in psychiatry today. What is the relationship between the brain and the mind? Between the physical organ and the subjective experience of consciousness? The Renaissance anatomists could dissect the brain. They could see the grey matter and the white matter, but they couldn't dissect a thought. They couldn't weigh a fear. They were mapping the hardware, but the software of the mind, with all its potential for glitches and bugs like the glass delusion, remained a complete mystery. They were proving that the body wasn't made of glass, but they had no way of proving why someone would believe that it was. The delusion demonstrated, in the most dramatic way possible, that the mind was not just a simple reflection of the physical body. It had a life and a logic of its own. So you can imagine the scene: an anatomically literate physician trying to reason with a glass patient. The doctor says, "Look at this drawing from Vesalius. See the fibula, the tibia, they are made of dense cortical bone, designed to withstand immense pressure." And the patient replies, "Yes, doctor, I see the drawing. But I can feel that mine are made of glass. I can hear them clinking when I walk. Your picture is of a general man. I am speaking of my own, specific, fragile self." For the anatomist, knowledge was something you discovered by looking outward, by dissecting and observing the material world. For the man with the glass delusion, knowledge was something you felt inwardly, a deep, intuitive certainty that no amount of external evidence could shake. This clash represents a fundamental turning point in Western thought. It's the beginning of a long, slow process of realizing that to understand the human condition, you can't just map the body. You also have to try to map the mind. And as the glass men proved, that second map is a much stranger and more treacherous territory. While King Charles VI might be the most famous glassman due to his royal status, he was by no means the only one. The delusion, as we've seen, became a sort of signature affliction for the melancholic elite. As you move into the 16th and 17th centuries, references to it start to appear in medical texts and literary works across Europe, giving us a small but fascinating gallery of other sufferers. These cases show us the different ways that delusion could manifest, and they almost always center on men of letters and measure. Perhaps the most well-documented case after Charles VI is one mentioned by the great 17th century scholar Robert Burton in his monumental work, The Anatomy of Melancholy. Burton was like the Wikipedia of his day for all things related to depression and mental distress. He collected stories from countless sources, and he describes a wealthy Italian nobleman who suffered from the glass delusion. This man's fear was so all-consuming that he took a very logical, if extreme, precaution. He surrounded himself with mattresses. He wouldn't just have pillows on his chair, he insisted that his servants lay down thick feather beds and quilts all over the floor of his home, wherever he went. He essentially lived his life in a giant padded cell of his own design. Burton also gives us one of the most specific and memorable examples of the delusion's focus: the man who believed his buttocks were made of glass. This seems to have been a recurring theme, a genuine subcategory of the delusion. This particular scholar, whose name is lost to history, was so convinced of his glassy posterior that he would never, ever sit down. He ate his meals standing up. He read his books standing up. He conducted all his business on his feet. He was in a state of perpetual, anxious standing. You can imagine the physical toll: the swollen ankles, the aching back, all in service of protecting a body part he was convinced would shatter on contact with a chair. It's a tragic image, but you can't help but admit, it's also a little bit funny. It's the kind of problem that feels like it was invented for a Monty Python sketch. But the fear wasn't always about shattering. The properties of glass, transparency and fragility, could be interpreted in different ways. The Spanish physician Francisco Valles, who served at the court of King Philippi I, wrote about a patient with a unique variation. This man didn't just think he was made of glass, he believed he was an atlas made of glass. Atlas, in Greek mythology, was the titan condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders for all eternity. So this patient had a double whammy of a delusion. Not only was he made of a supremely fragile material, but he also believed he was carrying the immense, crushing weight of the entire celestial sphere. He was terrified to move, not just for fear of shattering himself, but for fear that if he did, the heavens would come crashing down on everyone. His personal anxiety had metastasized into a cosmic-level catastrophe. You have to admit, if you're going to have a delusion, that's a pretty epic one. Then we have the case documented by the French physician Laurent Yaubert of a man who believed he was a glass urinal. This is a particularly sad and strange one. The man wouldn't lie down, for fear that he would be knocked over and spill his contents. He spent his days and nights standing stiffly in a corner, mimicking the shape and function of a common household object. This case highlights the themes of contamination and worthlessness that can accompany deep melancholy. He didn't see himself as a precious Venetian goblet, but as a humble, functional, and slightly disgusting vessel. A small but telling detail from these accounts is the auditory component. Many of these men didn't just believe they were made of glass, they claimed they could hear it. They would report a faint clinking or tinkling sound when they moved, the sound of their glass limbs gently knocking against each other. This is a fascinating insight into how a powerful delusion can recruit the senses to support its narrative. The brain, so convinced of the glass reality, starts to generate its own supporting evidence, creating phantom sounds to make the delusion feel more real. It's a feedback loop of anxiety. You think you're made of glass, so you listen for a clinking sound. You hear a faint clinking sound, which could be anything: a buckle on your shoe, a key in your pocket, and it confirms your fear, which makes you listen even more intently. And this variety of cases raises an interesting question that modern psychiatry still grapples with: why does a delusion take such a specific form to people can have the same underlying neuromechanical imbalance or psychological trauma? Yet one might develop a persecutory delusion about being followed by spies, while another develops a somatic delusion about being made of glass. Historians and psychologists who study culture-bound syndromes suggest that the content of a delusion is often pulled from a menu of available cultural symbols and fears. In Renaissance Europe, glass, with all its symbolic weight of fragility, value, and transparency, was a prominent item on that menu. Today, a person with a similar underlying condition might develop a delusion involving technology, believing their thoughts are being broadcast on the internet, or that a microchip has been implanted in their brain. The underlying psychological distress may be timeless, but the specific story the mind tells itself to explain that distress is a product of its time and place. These other glass men, these forgotten scholars and nobles, are crucial to our story. They show us that King Charles wasn't just a one-off anomaly. He was the most prominent example of a genuine, recurring pattern of thought. From the man living in a world of mattresses to the one holding up the sky, they each in their own strange way, give us a window into a mind seized by an elegant and terrifying idea. They were all members of a very exclusive, very anxious club, the Fraternity of the Glass Men. Let's pause for a moment from the historical overview and try to do something a little different. Let's try to truly get inside this delusion. I want you to imagine, just for the next few minutes, that it's you. You are not listening to a story about a man made of glass. You are a man made of glass. Let's try to live a single day in your new, fragile reality. The moment you wake up is the most dangerous time. You can't just jolt awake and sit up. That sudden movement could send a hairline fracture racing up your spine. No, you have to wake up slowly, consciously. You lie perfectly still under the heavy blankets, taking a mental inventory. You try to feel your limbs. Not for the familiar warmth of blood flow, but for the cold, hard integrity of their form. Are there any new cracks? Did you roll over too aggressively in the night and chip an elbow? You listen. You listen for the telltale tinkle that would signal a fresh break. Hearing nothing but the blood pounding in your ears are strange. Liquid sound inside a solid vessel. You begin the painstaking process of getting out of bed. You move with the slow, deliberate grace of a bomb disposal expert. You slide your legs, one by one, over the side of the bed. You don't place your feet on the floor. You position them. You can feel the cold stone through the thin soles of your slippers. And you imagine the microscopic vibrations traveling up your glass ankles. You push yourself up, not with your arms, but by engaging your core in a single, fluid, terrifying motion. You are upright. Success. The day's first great challenge has been met. Next, getting dressed. Your valet approaches, and you flinch. He knows the rules. No touching. He lays out your clothes, your softest linens. Your velvet doubled. The iron-reinforced one is for state occasions. Today is a quiet day of study. He holds the shirt open for you, and you have to carefully thread your own arms through, like posting fragile letters. Every rustle of the fabric against your skin sounds like sandpaper on a window pane. You hold your breath when the shirt goes over your head, terrified your ears or nose might snag and snap off. You make your way to breakfast. Walking is a controlled fall, a constant negotiation with gravity. You don't have a stride, you have a glide. Your feet barely leave the ground. You keep your arms held slightly away from your torso to prevent your glass elbows from clicking against your glass ribs. Every step is a calculation of risk. A loose floorboard, a curled edge of a carpet, these aren't minor annoyances, they are existential threats. You see a servant hurrying down the corridor towards you, and your heart is fragile. Glass pump seizes up. You press yourself against the wall, making yourself as small as possible, until he passes. He gives you a strange look. But you don't care. You survived the encounter. At the breakfast table, the challenges continue. You can't risk using a heavy silver goblet. You have a special cup, made of polished horn, which is lighter. You lift it to your lips with 2 hands. When you chew your bread, you do it carefully, trying not to let your glass teeth click together too sharply. The sound of your own eating is a source of constant anxiety. The rest of the day is a series of avoidances. You want to read a heavy book from your library, but you're afraid of dropping it on your glass foot. So you have a servant place it on a lectern for you. You want to sit by the fire for warmth. But you're terrified the sudden change in temperature will cause you to crack, like a cold glass plunged into hot water. So you stay in the middle of the room, in the temperate, stable air. Someone laughs, a loud, booming laugh from the courtyard below. The sound waves hit your body, and you feel a tremor run through your entire frame. For a moment, you are sure you are about to disintegrate into a pile of dust and shards. You stand rigid, waiting for the vibration to pass. Here's a small, intimate detail you might not have considered. What about an itch? You have an itch on your back, right between your shoulder blades. You can't just reach back and scratch it. Your fingernails, also made of glass, might gouge a piece out of your back. And you can't ask someone else to do it. The no touching rule is absolute. So you stand there, enduring the maddening, relentless itch, trying to relieve it by subtly rubbing your back against the soft velvet of a high-back chair. It's a tiny, private torture in a day filled with grand fears. This immersive experience helps us understand a question that puzzles both historians and clinicians: is the delusion a metaphor? Or is it a literal, sensory experience for the person living it? There is no debate. It is not a metaphor. The fear is not abstract. The academic debate centers on whether the origin is purely psychological, or if it has a neurological basis, a form of somatic sensory distortion where the brain is genuinely misinterpreting the signals it receives from the body. The man with the glass delusion isn't just thinking he's made of glass. His entire sensory world, from his hearing to his sense of touch, has been rewired to support this belief. He feels the coldness. He feels the rigidity. He hears the clinking. As dusk falls, you are exhausted, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer, unrelenting mental strain of keeping yourself in one piece. The simple act of being is a monumental effort. You reverse the process of the morning, carefully undressing and positioning yourself in bed. You lie there, a precious, fragile object in the dark, praying you make it through the night without a fatal crack. And as you drift off to sleep, your last thought is a simple one: please don't let me dream of falling. Living inside a glass body creates a fortress of solitude. We've seen how it affects your every movement, your every decision. But the most devastating impact of the delusion isn't on your relationship with chairs or doorways, it's on your relationship with other people. Humans are social creatures. We thrive on connection, on touch, on intimacy. The glass delusion systematically destroys all of it. It builds an invisible, impenetrable wall between you and everyone you love. Let's start with simple, everyday interactions. A friend claps you on the back in a moment of shared joy. For a normal person, it's a gesture of warmth and camaraderie. For you, the glass man, it's a shocking assault. You recoil in terror and anger. The friend is bewildered, hurt. They don't understand. How could they? You can't just say, "Don't do that. I'm made of glass." They'd think you were joking. Or worse, that you were really mad. So you don't explain. You just withdraw. You become cold, distant, prickly. You stop going to social gatherings. You avoid your friends. The fear of being shattered is so great that you'd rather shatter your friendships first. Now, let's make it more intimate. Think of your family. Your children run to you, wanting to be swept up in your arms for a hug. You can't do it. You have to hold up a hand and stop them. A look of panic in your eyes. To them, it's a rejection. They see a father who doesn't want to touch them, who shies away from their affection. They don't understand that you're not pushing them away, you're trying to protect your fragile form for them. But a child can't grasp that nuance. All they feel is the sting of the cold shoulder. The delusion robs you of the simple, profound joy of holding your child's hand or embracing your son. And then there is the most intimate relationship of all, your spouse, your partner. This is where the delusion inflicts its deepest wounds. Our romantic relationship is built on a foundation of physical closeness. It's the casual touches you pass in the hallway, the arm around the shoulder, the shared warmth of a bed at night. The glass delusion makes all of this impossible. Imagine you are Queen Isabel, married to King Charles VI. Your husband, the man you have built a life with, now looks at you with fear. He can't bear for you to touch him. When he has his episodes, he doesn't even recognize you. He sees you not as his wife, but as a potential threat, a blunt object that could cause him to break. The marital bed, once a place of intimacy, becomes a carefully demarcated space, a no man's land between two separate, lonely islands. How do you maintain a marriage, a partnership, across such a divide? The chronicles of Charles's reign are, understandably, discreet on this subject. But it's not hard to read between the lines. The emotional distance created by his physical fear was immense. It's said that the Queen eventually had to find solace and companionship elsewhere. And honestly, Who could blame her? The delusion starves a relationship of its most essential nutrients: affection, security, and physical contact. Here's a small, poignant detail that comes from the broader study of melancholy during this period. Physicians often noted that severe melancholics, like those with the glass delusion, would lose all interest in physical intimacy. They attributed this, in their humoral way, to the cold and dry nature of black bile, which was believed to extinguish the fires of passion. For the glass man, this was doubly true. It wasn't just a lack of desire, it was an active fear. The act of love, with its movements and its closeness, would seem like the most dangerous activity imaginable. It represented a complete loss of the rigid, careful control he tried to maintain at all times. This raises a difficult question that historians and biographers face. How do we separate the symptoms of the illness from the personal and political consequences? For example, the rift between Charles VI and Queen Isabel had massive political ramifications. Isabel became a powerful political player in her own right, often aligning with factions that opposed her husband's family. Academics still debate how much of this was a direct result of the emotional alienation caused by his illness versus her own political ambitions. Was she a victim of her husband's tragic condition, forced to fend for herself, or was she a shrewd operator who used his incapacity as an opportunity to seize power? The truth, as is so often the case, is likely a messy combination of both. His delusion created a vacuum, and her actions, whether born of necessity or ambition, rushed in to fill it. The tragedy of the glass delusion is that it's a perfect self-fulfilling prophecy of isolation. The sufferer feels fragile and vulnerable, so they push people away to protect themselves. But in pushing people away, they become isolated and alone, which only deepens their feelings of melancholy and vulnerability, reinforcing the delusion. It's a vicious cycle. You are trapped in a prison of glass, and you are the only one with the key, but you are too afraid to move to unlock the door. So you live a life without hugs, without handshakes, without a reassuring hand on your shoulder. You exist in a bubble of sterile safety, watching the warm, chaotic, tactile world of human connection from a distance. You are a spectator to your own life, and that might be the most shattering part of it all. You haven't broken into 1,000 pieces, but your life and your heart have been broken nonetheless. So you are trapped in this fragile, transparent body. You can't be touched. You move through the world like a ghost. But what happens in those quiet moments of self-reflection? What happens when you, the man made of glass, come face to face with a mirror? The mirror, in the Renaissance, was not the cheap, ubiquitous object it is today. Large, clear mirrors, like the ones produced in Venice, were still incredible luxury items. They were status symbols, objects of wonder and magic. A mirror was a portal. It was a flat surface that held a three-dimensional world. It was a piece of glass that could capture your soul, for a person who believed they were made of glass. The act of looking into a mirror must have been a profoundly strange and unsettling experience. So let's step back into your glass shoes. You stand before a large, polished mirror. What do you see? On one level, you see what everyone else sees. You see the reflection of a man. You see your velvet doubled, your tired eyes, the anxious set of your jaw. The mirror shows you a body of flesh and blood, or skin and hair. It presents you with objective, visual proof that you are, in fact, a normal human being. This should be a moment of relief, a triumphant refutation of your delusion. But it's not, because your internal reality, your deep, unshakable feeling of being glass, is far more powerful than the light bouncing off a silvered surface. So a disconnect happens. A strange, cognitive dissonance. The mirror is lying to you, or more subtly, it's showing you only the surface, the outward appearance, while you are intimately aware of the truth that lies beneath. You know that just under that thin veneer of skin, there is the cold, hard, crystalline structure of your true self. The mirror shows the illusion of flesh, you know the reality of glass. This creates a bizarre relationship with your own reflection. You might become obsessed with it, studying it for hours, trying to see past the facade. You might press your face close to the cold surface, trying to spot a crack in the illusion, a hint of the transparent reality underneath. You might look at your reflection and see a stranger, a costume of flesh that your glassy soul has been forced to inhabit. The man in the mirror looks solid, but you feel hollow, translucent. Let's explore a more poetic, and perhaps more psychologically accurate, possibility. Maybe when you look in the mirror, you don't just see a reflection of your physical form. Maybe you see a reflection of your qualities. Glass is transparent. It has no secrets. It hides nothing. When you look in the mirror, perhaps you feel that it can see right through you, into the depths of your melancholic soul. It sees your fear, your guilt, your sadness. The transparency of your imagined body becomes a metaphor for your emotional transparency. You feel exposed, vulnerable, as if your innermost thoughts are on public display. Here's a small, curious piece of folklore from the era that adds another layer to this. There was a common superstition that mirrors could steal a part of a person's soul. That's why people would cover the mirrors in a house where someone had died, to prevent the deceased spirit from being trapped. For a man who already felt his grip on reality was fragile, looking into a mirror could feel like a genuine risk. What if this magical glass object could not only see his glass soul, but capture it? This leads us to a philosophical question that was being fiercely debated by thinkers during this very period. What is the nature of the self? Is the self the body? Is it the mind? Is it the soul? The Glass Delusion is like a walking, talking embodiment of this debate. Historians of philosophy argue that this condition, in a way, prefigures the famous mind-body dualism of René Descartes, who would later write, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes rigorously separated the thinking mind, the res cogit ans, from the physical body, the res extensa. The man with the glass delusion was living this separation in the most extreme way imaginable. His I, his essential self, was a fragile, glassy thing, temporarily housed in a body of flesh that felt alien to him, a body he could see in the mirror but couldn't truly recognize as his own. The mirror, then, is not a true love confirmation, but a source of profound alienation. Every time you look into it, it reinforces the chasm between how the world sees you and how you experience yourself. It's a constant, silent argument that you can never win. Imagine the frustration. You try to explain your reality to others. You say, "But I am made of glass." They look at you. Then they hold up a small hand mirror and say, "But look, you are clearly made of flesh." And you look at the reflection, and you know, with a certainty that defies all logic, that the mirror is the one that's deluded, not you. It can only show the crude, outer shell. It cannot see the essential, fragile truth within. The mirror becomes a symbol of the world's inability to understand your unique and terrifying condition. It shows you your own face, but all you can feel is the invisible prison of glass it refuses to reflect. At its core, the Glass Delusion is a story of paradox. It's a story about the intersection of two opposite extremes, immense power and profound fragility. The people who suffered from this weren't peasants or paupers. They were, as we've established, the movers and shakers of their time, kings, dukes, powerful churchmen, and wealthy scholars. They were men who could command armies, pass laws, and shape the intellectual landscape of Europe. They sat at the very pinnacle of the social pyramid, wrapped in layers of privilege, authority, and influence. And yet, in their own minds, they were the most delicate objects imaginable. This is the central, fascinating contrast that makes the delusion so compelling. Let's take King Charles VI again. Here is a man who is, by definition, the embodiment of the state. In medieval political theory, the king had two bodies. He had his body natural, which was his physical, mortal self, subject to sickness and death. But he also had his body politic, a symbolic, immortal body that represented the kingdom itself. This body politic was supposed to be perpetual, stable, and powerful. Charles's delusion completely scrambled this concept. His body natural had become so fragile in his mind that it threatened to shatter the body politic. If the king, the symbolic head of the nation, believes he is made of glass, what does that say about the state of the nation itself? Is France also fragile? Is the kingdom on the verge of breaking apart? The king's private, internal sense of vulnerability became a public, political crisis. His personal fragility mirrored the kingdom's fragility during a period of civil war and ongoing conflict with England, the 100 Years' War. It was a terrifyingly literal case of as above, so below. This paradox also played out on a more personal level for the non-royal sufferers. Consider a wealthy merchant. He has built a commercial empire through shrewd decisions and ruthless negotiation. He is a pillar of his community, a man of substance and wealth. He commands respect. But he comes home, and he spends his evening terrified to sit down for fear of cracking his glass buttocks. His public persona is one of strength and control. His private reality is one of weakness and anxiety. Or think of the scholar. He is a master of logic and reason. He has read the ancient philosophers. He can construct flawless arguments and deconstruct the fallacies of others. His mind is his weapon, a finely honed instrument of intellectual power. But that same powerful mind has produced a belief so irrational, so impervious to logic, that it governs his every move. He can intellectually dominate a public debate, but he cannot conquer the private fear that a strong breeze might topple him over and shatter him. He is a titan of the mind trapped in a prison of his own making. This contrast was on the people of the time. Robert Burton, in his Anatomy of Melancholy, spends a great deal of time reflecting on this very issue. He saw melancholy as a great leveler. It could strike anyone, regardless of their station. He marveled at how the most powerful and learned men could be laid low by their own minds, afflicted with fears that a simple child would laugh at. Here's a little-known detail that deepens the irony. The very wealth and status of these men may have been a contributing factor to their illness. A peasant, whose life is a constant struggle for physical survival, doesn't have the luxury of developing a complex somatic delusion. His anxieties are external and immediate. Will the crops fail? Will I have enough food for the winter? The elite, however, were insulated from these basic survival fears. Their lives were physically safe and comfortable. Some historians of psychology speculate that this very lack of external threat may have caused their anxieties to turn inward. When you don't have to worry about a wolf at the door, you have more time to worry about the fragile state of your own soul, or, in this case, your own body. Their power and privilege gave them the mental space to cultivate these strange, introspective fears. This leads to a debate that continues to this day in social psychology. Does power corrupt? Or does it make one vulnerable in unexpected ways? The Glass Delusion suggests the latter. The immense pressure of maintaining power, the constant scrutiny, the isolation that often comes with being at the top, all of these factors can create a breeding ground for anxiety and paranoia. The delusion can be seen as a psychological escape clause. It's a way for a powerful man to abdicate responsibility. How can you be expected to lead an army or govern a state when you're made of glass? Your fragility becomes an excuse for withdrawal, a way to retreat from the crushing burdens of your position. So, the image of the glass man is not just an image of sickness, it's a powerful social commentary. It's a reminder that the external trappings of power, the crowns, the robes, the titles are just that, trappings. Beneath the powerful exterior, the human psyche can be as fragile as any other. It shows that vulnerability is a fundamental part of the human condition, one that no amount of wealth or status can eliminate. The men who commanded the world were, in the end, just as susceptible to the quiet, internal terrors as anyone else. They just found a more elaborate and bizarre way to express it. They built empires of power and influence on the outside, while living inside a tiny, transparent prison of their own fear. So how do we know so much about these strange and intimate fears from centuries ago? We aren't just relying on court gossip and the occasional doctor's note. The Glass Delusion, because it so perfectly captured the anxieties of the age, was also recorded and dissected in the literature and philosophy of the time. If you want to understand the mindset that produced the glass man, you have to read the books they were reading and writing. and there is one book that stands above all others as our single greatest, was Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, first published in 1621. This book is a beast. It's a sprawling, dense, endlessly fascinating labyrinth of a text. Burton was an English scholar and clergyman at Oxford, and he suffered from severe depression for most of his life. He wrote The Anatomy as a form of self-therapy, a way to understand his own affliction by dissecting every aspect of melancholy in the world around him. The result is one of the most wonderfully weird books ever written. It's a mix of medical advice, philosophical rambling, literary criticism, and thousands upon thousands of quotes from other authors, from the ancient Greeks to his own contemporaries. And right there, in the section on the symptoms of head melancholy, Burton gives us a classic, concise description of the glass delusion. He lists it matter-of-factly among other strange beliefs, writing that some melancholics think they are all glass. H.E.S. the one who gives us the famous anecdotes of the man who wouldn't sit down for fear of breaking his glass, but Exon the other who thought he was a urinal. For Burton, these weren't just funny stories. They were serious case studies, evidence of how profoundly a disturbed mind could distort the perception of the body. Reading Burton gives you a direct window into the 17th century understanding of the mind. He attributes the glass delusion, like all forms of melancholy, to the usual suspects: an excess of black bile, the influence of the planet Saturn, a bad diet, too much studying, or a life of idleness. But he's also a deeply compassionate writer. He doesn't mock these sufferers. He presents their cases with a kind of weary empathy, as if to say, look at the strange and terrible tricks our minds can play on us. As a lifelong sufferer of melancholy himself, he understood the terror and the absurdity of it from the inside. But Burton wasn't just a reporter, he was part of the culture that he was describing. His own writing style is, in a way, a perfect reflection of the melancholic mind he's trying to entomatize. It's obsessive. It's packed with details. It leaps from one subject to another. It's filled with lists and digressions. Reading The Anatomy of Melancholy feels a bit like getting lost in the thoughts of a brilliant but anxious insomniac. It's a literary embodiment of the very condition it seeks to explain. Beyond Burton, traces of the glass delusion and the broader theme of human fragility pop up in other literary works. The Spanish author Miguel de Cervantes, a contemporary of Burton, wrote a short novel called The Glass Graduate Elias Nido vi de Rira. It tells the story of a brilliant young scholar named Thomas Rodaya who, after eating a poison quince given to him by a lady trying to make him fall in love with her, becomes convinced that he is made entirely of glass. Cervantes' story is a brilliant exploration of the delusion. His hero, like the real-life sufferers, is terrified of being shattered. He walks down the middle of the street to avoid falling tiles, and he wears loose-fitting clothes. He answers questions from a distance, and people have to shout to him. But here's the twist in his glass state. He becomes famous for his incredible wisdom, because he believes he is transparent. He speaks with a brutal, piercing honesty. People come from all over Spain to ask him for advice, and his glass pronouncements are hailed as brilliant and insightful. He becomes a sort of celebrity madman. Then, just as suddenly, a monk cures him. He returns to his normal, fleshy state, but he finds that no one is interested in his wisdom anymore. He's just another ordinary scholar. The story is a poignant satire on how society is often more fascinated by brilliant madness than by simple, solid sanity. This is a really important, if subtle, point. Cervantes' story is fiction, of course, but literary historians debate how much it was based on real-life cases that Cervantes would have heard about. Was he simply using the delusion as a clever literary device? Or was he documenting a genuine psychological phenomenon that his readers would have recognized the fact that he could write this story and have his audience understand? The premise suggests that the idea of a glass man was part of the cultural conversation of the time. These texts, from Burton's dense treatise to Cervantes' witty novella, are invaluable. They show us that the glass delusion wasn't just a private, hidden sickness. It was a public fascination. It was a concept that writers and thinkers could use to explore the biggest questions of their time: the nature of the mind, the fragility of the human condition, the relationship between wisdom and madness, and the strange paradox of the powerful man who is secretly falling apart. The ink on the page becomes a kind of fossil record of these fragile souls, preserving their peculiar terror for us to read about centuries later, in the quiet safety of our own, very solid, flesh and blood bodies. In our modern, secular world, when we encounter a behavior as strange as the Glass Delusion, our first instinct is to look for a medical or psychological explanation. We reach for the DSM-5, not the Bible. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, the line between medicine, religion, and superstition was incredibly blurry. When a king or a scholar started acting strangely, refusing to sit down, claiming he was made of glass, people had a whole different set of categories to choose from. Was it a sickness? Yes. Perhaps it was melancholy. But could it also be something else? Could it be a sign from God, or, more frighteningly, could it be the work of the devil? For the average person living in Renaissance Europe, the supernatural was not a metaphor. It was a daily reality. The world was a stage for a constant battle between the forces of heaven and hell. Miracles, demonic possessions, and divine punishments were not just stories from the Bible, they were events that could and did happen. So, when a powerful nobleman suddenly developed a bizarre, inexplicable condition, it was natural to ask, is this a medical problem, or is it a spiritual one? Let's consider the divine angle first. Could the king's madness be a form of divine punishment? The idea of God striking down a proud or sinful ruler with madness has deep biblical roots. Think of King Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, who was driven from his kingdom to live like a wild animal. Many people in France saw Charles VI's suffering in this light. The belle des Ardents, the fiery ball that seemed to trigger his decline, felt like an act of God's judgment against a frivolous and decadent court. His subsequent glass fragility could be interpreted as a physical manifestation of his spiritual brokenness, a punishment for his or his kingdom's sins. In this view, the cure was not medicine, but prayer, penance, and national repentance. On the other hand, some might have seen it as a holy trial rather than a punishment. A person's suffering could be a test of their faith, a way for God to bring them, and the people around them, closer to holiness. A king who was stripped of his worldly pride and made to feel as fragile as glass is a king who was being taught a powerful lesson in humility. In this interpretation, the glass man wasn't cursed, he was in a state of profound, if painful, spiritual purification. He was being made transparent before God. But the most terrifying possibility was demonic influence. This was the age of witch hunts and a pervasive fear of demonic possession. The devil and his minions were believed to be capable of all sorts of mischief, including inflicting strange and horrible diseases upon the unsuspecting. A delusion as specific and bizarre as being made of glass seemed, to many, to have the signature of a supernatural prankster, a demon messing with a person's senses and perception of reality. The official procedure for distinguishing between genuine madness and demonic possession was laid out in texts like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. A priest or an exorcist might be called in. They would look for specific signs. Could the person speak in languages they had never learned? Did they show a violent aversion to holy objects, like a crucifix or holy water? Did they have knowledge of secret or future events? If the glass man showed any of these signs, his condition would be diagnosed. He was not a melancholic, he was a demoniac. And the treatment would shift from purges and bloodletting to prayers, exorcisms, and the rites of the church. Here's a small, telling detail from the historical records. During his worst episodes, King Charles VI would sometimes blaspheme, cursing God and the saints for the physicians. This was simply a symptom of his manic frenzy, but for the churchmen, it was potential evidence of a demonic entity speaking through the king's mouth. The court was in a constant state of anxiety, caught between these competing interpretations. This brings us to a major point of debate for historians of religion and medicine: how much real-world overlap was there between the doctor's office and The exorcist chamber. The traditional view is that they were two separate tracks, but more recent scholarship suggests they were often intertwined. A family might consult a physician and a priest. A doctor might prescribe a diet and also recommend that the patient go on a pilgrimage to a holy shrine. Some historians argue that the medical and supernatural explanations were not always mutually exclusive. A person could believe that the devil had caused the imbalance of black bile. In this case, you needed both the doctor to treat the humor and the priest to drive out the demon. The body and the soul were a single battlefield, and you needed to fight on both fronts. So when you see a man acting like he's made of glass, your diagnosis depends entirely on the lens you're using. Through a medical lens, you see a melancholic with an excess of black bile. Through a religious lens, you see a sinner being punished, a saint being tested, or a soul being tormented by a demon. And for many people at the time, all of these explanations could be true at once. This ambiguity is crucial. It tells us that the experience of living in that world was one of profound uncertainty. The boundaries between sickness and sin, between psychology and spirituality, were not clearly drawn. The glass man was not just a medical curiosity. He was a walking, talking theological problem. A mystery that forced everyone who encountered him to confront their deepest beliefs about the nature of God, the devil, and the fragile, unpredictable state of the human soul. We've talked about the influence of formal medicine, religion, and literature on the Glass Delusion, but there was another, more shadowy field of knowledge that likely played a powerful, yet subtle, role: alchemy. When we think of alchemy now, we tend to picture old wizards in pointy hats trying to turn lead into gold. And while that was part of it, alchemy in the Renaissance was much more. It was a complex and serious philosophical system, a form of proto-chemistry, and a spiritual practice all rolled into one. And its central metaphors and materials have a striking resonance with the fears of the glass man. At the heart of alchemy is the idea of transmutation. Alchemists believed that all matter was fundamentally one and that, with the right knowledge and processes, one substance could be transformed into another. The ultimate goal was the magnum opus, or great work, which involved a series of stages: heating, dissolving, purifying, recombining to transform a base material into a perfected one. This wasn't just about creating gold, it was also a spiritual allegory for the purification of the alchemist's own soul. Now, what was the most essential piece of equipment in any alchemist's lab? Glassware. The entire great work took place inside a sealed glass vessel, often called an alembic or a retort. This vessel was known as the vas hermeticum, the hermetic vase. It had to be made of glass for very specific reasons. First, as we've mentioned, glass was considered pure and non-reactive. It wouldn't corrupt the delicate process happening inside. Second, and most importantly, it was transparent. The alchemist needed to be able to watch the transformation, to observe the subtle changes in color and consistency that signaled the transition from one stage to the next. The glass vessel was the window into the secrets of creation. It's not hard to see the parallels. The man with the glass delusion essentially imagines his own body as an alchemical vessel. He is a walking vas hermeticum. His skin has become transparent, allowing him and he fears everyone else to see the turbulent processes happening within his soul. The delusion is a kind of involuntary, psychological alchemy. A profound internal transformation is taking place, and his body has taken on the characteristics of the vessel required for such a work. Furthermore, the alchemical process was seen as dangerous and delicate. If the heat was too high, or if the vessel was flawed, it could crack or explode, ruining the entire experiment. The alchemist lived with a constant low-grade anxiety about the integrity of his glassware. The glass man simply transfers that anxiety from the lab bench to his own body. His fear of shattering is the fear of a failed alchemical operation. If he breaks, the great work of his own spiritual and physical being will be lost. Here's a specific, nerdy alchemical detail that connects directly. One of the key stages in the alchemical process was sometimes referred to as the vitrification, or vitrification. This was a stage of intense heat where the material being worked on would be purified and transformed into a glass-like substance. Some alchemical texts describe this as a necessary step on the path to perfection. So, in the symbolic language of alchemy, becoming glass could be seen as a crucial, if terrifying, part of the spiritual journey. The glass man might be, in a metaphorical sense, stuck in the vitrification stage, unable to complete his transformation. This is where we get into a fascinating historical debate. Was there a direct, conscious link between alchemy and the Glass Delusion, or was it an unconscious, symbolic overlap? Some scholars argue that educated men of the era, who would have been familiar with alchemical texts and ideas, might have consciously or subconsciously used alchemical language to frame their psychological distress. Their melancholy was a putrefaction, their anxiety was a dangerous heating, and their sense of fragility was the glass vessel about to break. Other historians are more cautious, suggesting that alchemy and the Glass Delusion didn't directly influence each other, but rather both grew out of the same cultural soil. They were parallel expressions of a similar set of anxieties about transformation, purity, and the hidden inner workings of things. Regardless of the directness of the link, the alchemical mindset provides a powerful key for unlocking the delusion's meaning. It reframes it from being as simple as our fear into a complex allegory for inner turmoil. The body is no longer just a body, it is a laboratory. The soul is not just a soul, it is a substance undergoing a dangerous and uncertain transformation. Think of it this way for the alchemist. The glass vessel was both incredibly precious and incredibly vulnerable. It was the key to everything, but it was also the weakest link. This is the exact paradox the glass man lives with every single day. He feels he is undergoing some profound internal process, that his mind and soul are in a state of flux. But the very thing that contains this process, his body, is imagined to be impossibly fragile. Here's the alchemist and the exploding retort, the experimenter and the failed experiment, all at once. His life is a stalled great work, and he is trapped inside the very vessel that was meant to perfect him. We spent a lot of time inside the minds of these fragile noblemen and in the halls of their palaces. But what about everyone else? The vast majority of people in Renaissance Europe were not kings or scholars. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and soldiers. What did the world look like from their perspective when they encountered one of these glass men? Let's be honest, it probably looked pretty ridiculous. Imagine you're a baker in 15th century Paris. You're up at dawn, kneading dough, your hands and arms covered in flour, your muscles aching from a life of hard, physical work. Your body is a tool. It gets tired, it gets sore, but it's solid. It's dependable. Then, you step outside to get some air and you see a local nobleman's procession passing through the street. But the nobleman isn't riding his horse with confidence. He's perched on it stiffly, as if it were made of dynamite. He's surrounded by servants who are carefree, pushing people out of the way. Not with the usual arrogance of a lord's retinue, but with a kind of nervous urgency. The nobleman himself is pale, his eyes wide with fear, and he's clutching the pommel of his saddle like his life depends on it. You turn to the person next to you and ask what's going on. The person, a street vendor who knows all the city gossip, leans in and whispers, "That's the Baron, dear, a little bit crazy. They say he thinks he's made of glass." You'd stare, dumbfounded. Then, once the Baron was safely out of earshot, you'd probably have a good laugh. The idea is just so absurd, so completely alien to your lived experience of the world. A man made of glass, what? Does he think he'll get a crack in him if a pigeon flies too close? The common folk would have seen this behavior not through the lens of humor or theory or alchemical symbolism, but through the lens of common sense. And from a common sense perspective, a rich, powerful man acting like he's about to shatter is just funny. It's the ultimate example of a first world problem for the 15th century. It would have been a source of endless jokes, stories, and popular songs. The Glass Baron or the Crystal Count would become a local character, a byword for eccentric, out-of-touch aristocratic behavior. This popular reaction is crucial because it highlights the immense class divide in how mental distress was perceived and expressed. For the elite, as we've seen, the glass delusion could be framed as a sophisticated, intellectual form of melancholy. For the commoner, it was just plain madness. There was no prestige in it. A farmer who started claiming he was made of glass wouldn't be sent to a learned physician for a diet of moist foods. He'd likely be ostracized, knocked, or perhaps even locked up by his village as a dangerous lunatic who couldn't be trusted to do his chores. Here's a little piece of social history that puts this in context. In medieval and Renaissance society, madness was often tolerated as long as it wasn't disruptive. Villages and towns had their local fools or eccentrics, who were often allowed to wander freely, but this tolerance had its limits. If a person's madness made them unable to work, or if they became a danger to themselves or others, the community would step in. The glass nobleman could afford to be non-functional. His wealth and status created a bubble of safety around him. He had servants to manage his life, a soft bed to lie in, and a family to ensure he didn't starve. A glass peasant had none of these safety nets. His delusion would be a death sentence, not because it would shatter him, but because it would prevent him from working the land and feeding himself. This difference in perception is something social historians are deeply interested in. Did the common folk have their own culture-bound syndromes that we simply don't have records of? It's highly likely. The historical record is biased towards the literate elite. We have the writings of kings, doctors, and scholars, but we don't have the diaries of 16th century ploughmen. The anxieties of the poor were probably expressed in different ways, perhaps through folk beliefs and curses, or fears of a bad harvest being a supernatural punishment. Their delusions, if they had them, would have been about things that mattered in their world: crops, livestock, and the daily struggle for survival. The fear of being made of glass was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. So the laughter of the baker is more than just mockery. It's a sign of a deep cultural gap. It's the sound of one reality, the reality of dirt, sweat, and physical labor colliding with another, completely different reality of abstract, introspective, and frankly bizarre aristocratic anxiety. When the commoners saw the glass man, they didn't see a fragile soul or a complex medical case. They saw the ultimate proof that the rich and powerful were living in a different world altogether. A world so detached from reality that they could afford to worry about things that were, to any sane, hard-working person, completely and utterly unbelievable. The nobleman-esque era was the peasant's punchline. Well, friends, with its mad king and rich literary sources, is the heartland of our story. It's important to remember that the glass delusion wasn't just a French eccentricity. Like any compelling idea or potent fear, it didn't respect national borders. As the 16th and 17th centuries progressed, this peculiar form of melancholy echoed across the courts, universities, and cities of Europe, popping up in Spain, the Italian states, the Low Countries, and even England. This geographical spread is crucial because it proves that the delusion wasn't tied to a specific political crisis, like the madness of a single French king. Instead, it was connected to a much broader European cultural and intellectual climate. The same forces were at play everywhere: the medical framework of the four humors, the rise of the scholar class, the prestige of melancholy, and the symbolic power of glass as a luxury material. Let's take a quick tour. We've already mentioned the Spanish connection through Cervantes and his novel The Glass Graduate. The fact that a Spanish author could write such a story for a Spanish audience tells us the concept was recognizable there. Spain, at the height of its golden age, was a society grappling with immense wealth, rigid courtly etiquette, and intense religious orthodoxy. It was a perfect breeding ground for the kind of high-status, introspective anxiety that could lead to a man believing he was an atlas made of glass. The pressure to maintain one's own honor and public image was immense, making the fear of a sudden, shattering disgrace a very potent one. Moving to Italy, the birthplace of the Renaissance and the home of Venetian glass, we find more traces. We mentioned Robert Burton's account of the Italian nobleman who padded his entire world with mattresses. Italian society was a collection of competitive city-states, each with its own court full of intrigue, ambition, and paranoia. It was also the center of the new learning of humanism. Italian scholars were rediscovering classical texts and debating the nature of the soul and the dignity of man. In this environment of intense intellectual and political competition, the Glass Delusion emerged as a stark metaphor for the fragility of both political power and scholarly reputation. Then we go north, to the Low Countries, what we now know as Belgium and the Netherlands. This region was a bustling hub of commerce, art, and science. It was home to great thinkers like Erasmus and pioneering physicians like Vesalius and Levinas Lemnius, whom we've mentioned. Physicians in cities like Leiden and Amsterdam were meticulously cataloguing unusual medical cases. And the Glass Delusion appears in their notes as a particularly striking form of melancholy. For these doctors, it was a fascinating puzzle, a prime example of how the vapors of black bile could so dramatically fool the senses. Even in England, a place somewhat removed from the continental mainstream, the idea resonated. Robert Burton, our main source, was English, and he was clearly writing for an audience that understood these concepts. The English court and universities were just as concerned with melancholy as their continental counterparts. The melancholy Jacques in Shakespeare's As You Like It is a classic example of the contemplative, brooding, intellectual type that was considered most susceptible to this family of illnesses. While there aren't as many famous, documented cases of glass men in England, the concept was certainly present in their medical and literary imagination. Here's a small but fascinating detail that shows how these ideas traveled. Medical and philosophical texts were international bestsellers among the European intellectual elite. A book published in Basel by a Swiss physician could be read within a few years by scholars in Salamanca, Paris, and Oxford. They all read Latin, the universal language of scholarship, so they were all participating in the same conversation. When a doctor in France wrote about treating a glass man, a doctor in Italy could read it, recognize the symptoms in one of his own patients, and then write about it in his own book, perpetuating and spreading the concept. This international dimension leads to a kind of chicken and egg debate among historians. Did the delusion spread because the underlying psychological condition was genuinely occurring everywhere? Or did the idea of the delusion spread through these texts, giving people a new and fashionable way to categorize and express their distress? In other words, did reading about a French nobleman with glass buttocks make it more likely that an English scholar suffering from anxiety might start to worry about his own posterior? This is part of a larger academic discussion about the looping effect of psychiatric categories. The argument is that when you create a new diagnosis, people can start to subconsciously conform to it. The category itself can shape the experience of the illness. It's possible that the glass delusion became a thing in part because it was written about so compellingly. It became a recognized, if bizarre, way to be melancholic. A script that people could, unconsciously, follow. So, the echoes of the delusion across Europe show us it wasn't an isolated French phenomenon. It was a pan-European conversation about fragility, madness, and the mind. From the sun-drenched courts of Spain to the rainy quads of Oxford, the glass man was a recurring phantom, a symbol of an anxiety that knew no borders. He was a product of a shared intellectual world, a testament to the fact that even our most private fears are often shaped by the grand, international currents of the culture we live in. We'd explored the medical, psychological, and even the alchemical interpretations of the glass delusion, but we can't forget the most primal, and perhaps most widespread, explanation of all, especially among the less educated populace: magic. In a world where the lines between science and superstition were blurry, our affliction as bizarre as the glass delusion was prime territory for supernatural blame. If it wasn't God's punishment or a demon's possession, then it must be the result of a curse, a spell, the evil eye, in short, the work of a witch. The 16th and 17th centuries were the peak of the great European witch hunt. A pervasive and deadly paranoia had settled over the continent. People believed that a secret conspiracy of witches was working with the devil to undermine Christendom, and they saw their evil influence everywhere in failed crops, sick livestock, And, of course, in strange and inexplicable human illnesses. Think about it from the perspective of a villager or a townsperson. The local lord, who has always been strong and healthy, suddenly starts acting erratically. He refuses to see people. He moves with a bizarre, stiff gait, and a rumor starts to circulate that he believes he is made of glass. To a mind steeped in folklore and the rhetoric of the witch trials, this doesn't sound like a medical problem. It sounds like black magic. The logic was simple and terrifying. A witch, through a pact with a demon, could cast a spell to alter a person's perception of their own body. They could glamour them, creating an illusion so powerful that the victim believed it to be real. The Glass Delusion fit this pattern perfectly. It was specific. It was unnatural. And it was tormenting. It had all the hallmarks of a malicious, targeted curse. So when a nobleman started exhibiting these symptoms, the question in the castle kitchens and the local taverns wouldn't be, what is the state of his humours? It would be, who did this to him? Who has a grudge against the Lord? Who is the witch that cursed him? Suspicion would inevitably fall on the usual suspects: a disgruntled tenant, a rival family, or most often, a vulnerable local woman, an elderly widow, a healer who worked with herbs, or anyone who was considered an outsider. Here's a specific and chilling detail from the literature on witchcraft. One of the powers frequently attributed to witches was the ability to induce self-shock, a sudden, sharp pain or illness believed to be caused by invisible arrows shot by elves or fairies at the witch's command. A person with a glass delusion, who might feel sudden pains or interpret any bump as a catastrophic impact, could easily believe they were under this kind of magical assault. The witch wasn't just making him think he was glass, she was actively trying to shatter him with her dark arts. The legal and theological texts of the time, including the Malleus Maleficarum, gave credence to these fears. They contained detailed descriptions of how witches could cause impotence, madness, and all manner of physical ailments through spells and cursed objects. A nobleman seeking an explanation for his terrifying condition, or a family trying to make sense of a loved one's suffering, might find a more satisfying answer in the witch hunter's handbook than in the physician's medical text. The medical explanation, an imbalance of black bile, was abstract and impersonal. The magical explanation offered a clear villain and, at least in theory, a clear path to a solution: find the witch and break the curse. This brings up a painful historical question that scholars of the witch trials still grapple with. Did accusations of witchcraft ever stem from real, but misunderstood, medical conditions like the Glass Delusion? It's almost certain that they did. The historical evidence is often ambiguous, but it's not hard to imagine a scenario where a powerful man's mental breakdown triggers a witch hunt. The sufferer, in his paranoia, might even make the accusation himself, genuinely believing that a specific person had cursed him. His testimony, as a nobleman, would carry immense weight, and the accused, like a poor and defenseless woman, would stand little chance of proving her innocence against the evidence of the Lord's bizarre affliction. The Glass Delusion, in this context, becomes more than just a psychological curiosity. It becomes a potential catalyst for violence and injustice. The private terror of one powerful man could easily spill out and become the public terror of a witch trial. The invisible fractures he feared in his own body could lead to the very real and brutal fracturing of his community. So when we try to understand the world of the Glass Man, we have to see it as a place filled not just with physicians and priests, but with suspected witches and hidden curses. The fear wasn't just of an internal, humoral imbalance, it was of an external, magical assault. For many, the most logical explanation for a man believing he was made of glass was not that his mind was playing tricks on him, but that a malicious human agent, armed with supernatural power, was actively trying to destroy him. This interpretation turned a personal health crisis into a criminal investigation, and a cry for help into a deadly accusation. It's a sobering reminder that in an age of fear, even the most outlandish delusion can have terrifyingly real-world consequences. For over 2 centuries, the Glass Delusion haunted the margins of European consciousness, a strange testament to the anxieties of the age. It was explained by humors, alchemy, and witchcraft. But as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, a new wind was blowing through the intellectual landscape of Europe. This was the beginning of the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. And one of the key figures who helped to change the very way people thought about the mind and the body was the French philosopher. Descartes probably never met a glass man himself, but his work, in a way, delivered a philosophical death blow to the worldview that made the delusion possible. He wasn't a doctor, he was a philosopher and mathematician obsessed with one thing's certainty. He wanted to find a foundation for knowledge that was absolutely unshakable. To do this, he famously decided to doubt everything: his senses, the world around him, even his own body. And in this process of radical doubt, he arrived at his famous conclusion: cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He realized that while he could doubt the existence of his body, it could, after all, be a dream or an illusion. He could not doubt the existence of his own doubting mind. The very act of thinking proved the existence of a thinking thing, res cogit, ans. This led him to propose a radical separation between the mind and the body, a concept now known as Cartesian dualism. For Descartes, the mind or soul was a non-physical, immaterial substance. The body, on the other hand, was a machine. A complex, intricate machine made of flesh and blood, operating according to the predictable laws of physics. Just like a clock or a fountain, the two were connected, somehow, through the pineal gland in the brain. But they were fundamentally different kinds of stuff. This idea might sound abstract and academic, but its implications were revolutionary, and they hit the glass delusion right where it lived. Remember how the humoral theory explained the delusion: it saw the mind and body as deeply intertwined. A physical substance, black bile, directly caused a mental symptom, the delusion. The body's chemistry dictated the mind's reality. Descartes' philosophy severed this direct link. If the mind is an immaterial, thinking thing, and the body is just a physical machine, then it becomes much harder to imagine how a hot or cold humor could directly create a complex, specific belief like I am made of glass. More importantly, the body as machine metaphor completely changed the way people thought about their physical selves. A machine is made of working parts. It can be understood, repaired, and, crucially, it is made of the stuff it is actually made of. A human body is made of muscle, bone, and blood, just as a clock is made of gears and springs. The idea that it could be made of a completely different substance, like glass, started to sound not just medically wrong, but philosophically absurd. Descartes himself actually uses a very similar example. In his Meditations, he talks about the nature of sensory errors. He says that a person with jaundice sees everything as yellow, or that an amputee might feel a phantom limb. He uses these examples to show that the senses can be deceptive, but he frames these deceptions as errors in the machine, faulty signals being sent from the body to the mind. He even briefly mentions the melancholic who thinks his body is an earthenware pot. For Descartes, this isn't a humoral imbalance, it's a profound error of judgment. A case where the rational mind has failed to correctly interpret the faulty data coming from the bodily machine. Here's a small but significant detail. Descartes' focus on reason and logic as the ultimate path to truth put subjective feelings and bodily sensations in a subordinate position. For the glass man, the feeling of being glass was his ultimate truth. But in a Cartesian world, feeling isn't enough. You have to be able to rationally prove it. And the belief that you are made of glass is, when subjected to logical scrutiny, completely irrational. The Enlightenment valued clear, logical thought above all. And the glass delusion was the epitome of murky, irrational, unenlightened thinking. Now historians of ideas fiercely debate the true impact of Descartes. Was his philosophy a direct cause of the decline of ideas like the four humors? Or was he simply giving voice to a change that was already underway? It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Some argue that Descartes' powerful, elegant system provided the intellectual ammunition needed to dismantle the old worldview. He gave people a new, modern way to think about themselves. Others suggest that he was a product of his time, and that the groundwork for his ideas had already been laid by the scientific discoveries of people like Vesalius in anatomy and Galileo in physics. Regardless of the cause and effect relationship, the result was clear. The philosophical ground was shifting. The old, holistic view of the body and soul as a single, interconnected entity was being replaced by the new, dualistic model of the thinking mind and the mechanical body. In this new world, the glass delusion began to lose its conceptual footing. It started to sound less like a plausible, if extreme, form of melancholy, and more like a relic from a superstitious, pre-scientific age. Descartes didn't cure any glass men, but he helped to create a world where believing you were one no longer made any sense. The philosophical shift started by Descartes was like a slow, tectonic movement. It didn't change things overnight, but it created the conditions for a massive earthquake in the world of medicine. As the Enlightenment gained steam in the 18th century, the ancient theory of the four humours, which had been the bedrock of Western medicine for 2 millennia, finally began to crumble. And as it fell, it took the logic of the glass delusion down with it. This wasn't just about philosophy. The scientific revolution was in full swing. The invention of the microscope had opened up a previously invisible world. For the first time, scientists could see tiny organisms, blood cells, and the fine structure of tissues. The body was no longer a mysterious bag of liquids. It was a universe of incredible, observable complexity. This new knowledge, based on direct observation and experimentation, made the old humoral theories look like primitive guesswork. Doctors and scientists started to propose new theories of disease. Some believed illnesses were caused by problems with the nervous system, focusing on the tension and laxity of nerve fibers. Others developed early cellular theories, suggesting that disease was a problem at the level of the body's smallest building blocks. The focus shifted from the body's overall balance to the health of its specific parts and systems. The era of anatomy and physiology had truly begun. In this new medical landscape, the glass delusion became a kind of diagnostic fossil. A doctor trained in the new medicine of the 18th century would be completely baffled by it. If a patient came to him claiming to be made of glass, the doctor would have no framework to understand it. He could no longer say, "Ugh, an excess of cold. Dry back bile has vitrified his spirit." That explanation now sounded like superstitious nonsense. The new medicine, with its focus on nerves and fibers, didn't have a neat category for such a bizarre, specific belief. As a result, the way madness was categorized began to change. The old, all-encompassing term melancholy started to break apart into more specific conditions. Doctors began to create new classification systems for mental illness, based on observable behaviors and symptoms, rather than supposed humoral causes. They started coining new terms, like hypochondrias for people with excessive health anxieties, or monomania for people obsessed with a single, irrational idea. The glass delusion, if it appeared at all, would have been classified as a severe form of one of these. A monomania with a somatic focus. The name changed, and with it, the entire understanding of the condition. It was no longer a prestigious affliction of the sensitive soul. It was just a strange and unfortunate mental tic. Here's a small, but telling piece of evidence for this shift. In the 18th century, there was a growing public fascination with sensibility. A person of sensibility was someone who felt things deeply: joy, sorrow, sympathy. It was the new, fashionable way to be emotionally refined. But sensibility was a disorder of the nerves, not the humours. It was about having a finely tuned nervous system that was easily overstimulated. While it shared some traits with the old melancholy like fragility and sensitivity, its underlying explanation was completely different. It was rooted in the new, scientific language of nerves and vibrations. The glass man of the Renaissance was replaced by the man of sensibility of the Enlightenment, who might faint at a sad story or be overcome by a beautiful sunset. The form of fashionable fragility had changed because the medical theory behind it had changed. This transition wasn't smooth. and historians of medicine debate how quickly the new ideas actually replaced the old ones. In the top universities and among the elite physicians in major cities, humoral theory was largely discredited by the mid-18th century. However, among country doctors and in the popular imagination, these old ideas lingered for a very long time, even into the 19th century. A local barber surgeon might still recommend bloodletting to balance a patient's humors long after the professors in Paris had declared the theory dead. It was a messy, gradual process of change. But for the class of people who were most susceptible to the glass delusion, the educated elite, the change was decisive. They were the ones reading the new philosophy and consulting the fashionable new doctors. They were the ones who wanted to appear modern and enlightened, clinging to a belief rooted in the old, discredited world of alchemy and humors would have seemed backward and superstitious. The cultural and intellectual incentives that had once supported the delusion were now gone. So the new chapter of medicine effectively wrote the glass man out of its pages. He didn't fit into the new mechanical models of the body or the new neurological theories of the mind. He was a product of a world where the physical and the spiritual, the body and the mind, were magically unmessily intertwined. As science began to neatly separate those worlds, drawing clear lines between them, the strange, hybrid creature that was the glass man found he no longer had a place to exist. The medical revolution didn't cure him, it simply made him impossible. Like a species that can no longer survive in a changing climate, the glass delusion slowly began to die out. The 18th century saw it become a rarity, and by the 19th century, it had all but vanished from medical records. The worldview that had sustained it, the world of humors, alchemy, and magic, had been replaced by the new certainties of science and reason. The cultural ecosystem was no longer hospitable to this particular form of fear. So where did the lost glass men go? They faded into the footnotes of medical history, becoming case studies of a bygone era's madness. Tracking down the definitive lost case is tricky, as medical records from the period can be sparse, but the consensus points to the delusion becoming exceptionally rare by the early 1800s. The occasional report would surface, but it was treated as a bizarre anomaly, a throwback, rather than as a recognized, if uncommon, condition. One of the last widely discussed cases appears, fittingly, in the work of a 19th century French psychiatrist. Esquirol was a student of Philippe Pinel, the famous physician who, during the French Revolution, symbolically unchained the inmates of the Paris asylums. This was the birth of a new, more humane approach to mental illness. Esquirol was a great cataloguer of madness, and in his writings, he mentions a patient with the old delusion, but his description is telling. He doesn't treat it with the philosophical curiosity of a Renaissance physician. He sees it simply as a monomania, a symptom of a diseased brain. The magic was gone. The poetry was gone. It was just a pathological data point. The patient was no longer a nobleman in his study, but an inmate in an asylum. This shift in location is incredibly significant. The glass delusion had started as a fashionable disease of the elite, something a person could suffer from within the padded walls of their own home. By the 19th century, this kind of severe delusion was grounds for institutionalization. The glass man was no longer a tortured genius, he was a patient, a problem to be managed by the new professional class of psychiatrists in the growing network of asylums. Why did it disappear so completely? We've traced the big reasons: the fall of humoral theory and the rise of a mechanical view of the body. But there are a few other, more subtle factors at play. One is the changing nature of glass itself. During the Industrial Revolution, new manufacturing processes made glass cheap and common. It was no longer a rare, magical luxury item. It was used for windows in ordinary homes, for beer bottles, for canning jars. Glass lost its aristocratic mystique. It became mundane, and it's much harder to build a prestigious, soul-defining delusion around a material that's used to bottle pickles. The symbolic power of the substance had evaporated. Another factor is the rise of new anxieties. The 19th century had its own set of fears, born from the industrial, urban world that was taking shape. People's anxieties started to revolve around new technologies and new social pressures. They worried about the speed and danger of trains, the grime and disease of the industrial city, the pressures of a new capitalist economy. The old, introspective fear of being fragile and transparent was replaced by a new set of external, modern fears. The psychological menu of available delusions had changed. Here's a small, poignant detail about this transition. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as technologies like the telegraph, telephone, and electricity became more common, psychiatrists started to see new kinds of delusions. Patients began to believe their thoughts were being controlled by electrical wires, or that messages were being sent into their brains via radio waves. This is the modern equivalent of the Glass Delusion. The sufferers were using the cutting-edge, slightly mysterious technology of their day as a metaphor to explain their internal distress. Just as the Renaissance noblemen had used the cutting-edge, mysterious technology of Venetian glass. This disappearance has led to a fascinating debate among medical historians and sociologists. Is it possible for a mental illness to truly go extinct, or does it simply change its clothes? So to speak, most experts lean towards the latter view. They argue that the underlying psychological conditions, severe anxiety, depression with psychotic features, schizophrenia, are timeless. They are part of the human condition. What changes is the content of the delusion, the specific story the mind tells to make sense of its suffering. The Glass Delusion was the culturally appropriate costume for a certain kind of mental distress in the Renaissance. When that costume went out of fashion, the distress found a new one to wear. So the last glass man wasn't really the last. He was just the last one to use that particular language to describe his fear. He stands as a lonely figure at the end of a long, strange tradition. He is a bridge between two worlds. Behind him lies the medieval world of spirits and humors. Before him lies the modern world of nerves, brains, and asylums. His belief, once a potent symbol of intellectual fragility, now sounds like a faint, tinkling echo from a distant, almost unimaginable past. The stage was set for a new era, with a new cast of anxieties, leaving the glass man to take his final, careful bow and exit history stage. So the glass man has vanished from the history books, a ghost of a bygone era. It's easy to look back at him from our 21st century vantage point and see him as a historical curiosity, a strange, primitive expression of fear from a superstitious time. We have neuroscience. We have cognitive therapy. We have SSRIs. We are modern. We are rational. We would never believe something so silly. But would we? The truth is, while the specific belief in a glass body has faded, the underlying anxieties that fueled it are still very much with us. The Glass Delusion hasn't truly disappeared, it has simply shape-shifted. It echoes in the diagnoses and anxieties of our own time, wearing a modern, scientific costume instead of a Renaissance one. The fear of being fragile, of being contaminated, of one's own body being alien and untrustworthy, these are timeless human fears. Let's look at some modern parallels. Consider body dysmorphic disorder, BDD. This is a condition where a person becomes obsessed with a perceived flaw in their appearance. A flaw that is either minor or completely invisible to others. They might spend hours looking in the mirror, convinced their nose is crooked or their skin is scarred. Their belief in this flaw is so powerful that it can cause them to become completely housebound, to avoid social contact, and even to seek out endless, unnecessary plastic surgeries. Doesn't this sound familiar? It's the ghost of the Glass Delusion. Like the glass man, the person with BDD has a perception of their body that is completely at odds with objective reality. Their suffering is not caused by the body itself, but by a distorted idea about the body. They are trapped in a prison of perception, fixated on a flaw that no one else can see, just as the glass man was fixated on a fragility that no one else could confirm. Or think about modern health anxiety, what used to be called hypochondrias. This is the constant, overwhelming fear that you have a serious and diagnosed illness. Every minor symptom, a headache, a cough, but which is interpreted as evidence of a catastrophic disease, like a brain tumor or cancer. People with severe health anxiety live in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning their bodies for signs of disaster. They are, in a very real sense, living with a sense of profound physical fragility. They may not think their bones are made of glass, but they live with the same constant, low-level terror that their body is about to betray them, to break down at any moment. Here's a specific, modern phenomenon that acts as an eerie echo of our story: the rise of so-called medically unexplained syndromes, like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. These are conditions characterized by real, debilitating symptoms, pain, exhaustion, but often with no clear, observable biological markers. For a long time, patients with these conditions were often dismissed by the medical community, told that their suffering was all in their heads. It's a modern version of the disconnect experienced by the glass man. The patient knows their suffering is real, but the tools of objective medicine sometimes fail to see it, creating a profound sense of alienation and invalidation. This brings us to a crucial, ongoing debate in modern psychiatry and a key point of discussion for medical anthropologists. How much are our modern diagnostic categories, like BDD or generalized anxiety disorder, also culture-bound? We see them as objective, scientific labels. But a historian 500 years from now might look back at our time and see our anxieties about chemical imbalances or serotonin levels as just as culturally specific as the Renaissance fear of black bile. The argument isn't that these conditions aren't real, the suffering is absolutely real, but that the way we name, frame, and understand them is profoundly shaped by our own culture's dominant ideas about science, technology, and the body. Our modern glass men might not fear shattering, but they express their fragility in other ways. They might fear contamination by germs, toxins, or GMOs. They might believe their bodies are being invisibly harmed by electromagnetic radiation from cell phones and Wi-Fi. This is the same fundamental fear of a fragile body under assault from an invisible threat, but it's dressed up in the language of 21st century science and technology. The witch's curse has been replaced by the fear of carcinogens. The alchemical vessel has been replaced by the vulnerable genome. The story of the Glass Delusion, then, isn't just a quirky tale from the past. It's a mirror. It reminds us that our relationship with our own bodies is often strange, irrational, and deeply influenced by the world around us. It shows us that fear is a powerful storyteller, capable of spinning the most elaborate and convincing narratives. We may have traded our belief in glass buttocks for a fear of gluten, but the underlying human tendency to project our anxieties onto our own fragile, mysterious flesh remains as strong as ever. The echo of the glass man's tinkling footfalls can still be heard, faintly, in the waiting rooms of modern clinics and in the quiet, anxious thoughts of our own sleepless nights. So here we are, at the end of this strange and fragile journey. We've walked through the cold halls of the Louvre with a clanking king. We've peered into the alchemist's smoky lab. And we've sat with scholars who were terrified of their own chairs. We've traced the life and death of a single, bizarre idea, the belief that a human being could be made of glass. What began with the trauma of a French king at a fiery masquerade ball became, for over 200 years, a recurring phantom in the European imagination. It was a disease of the elite, a strange badge of honor for the melancholic and the scholarly. It was a condition that perfectly captured the paradox of the Renaissance man, powerful and learned, yet obsessed with his own inner fragility. The sufferers saw themselves not as flesh and blood, but as priceless, brittle works of art, Venetian goblets that could shatter at any moment. We saw how the medical minds of the day tried to make sense of it. They reached for their trusted theory of the four humors, diagnosing the problem as an excess of cold, dark, heavy black bile. They prescribed treatments that sound horrifying to us now: purges, bloodletting, and bizarre psychological tricks, like surprise beatings or mock executions by fire, all in an attempt to shock the mind back into alignment with reality. But the delusion was more than just a medical curiosity. It was a cultural phenomenon. It resonated with the symbolic power of glass, a material that was at once a luxury good, a scientific tool, and an alchemical vessel. It reflected the deep-seated fears of a world that still believed in witchcraft and demonic possession, where any strange illness could be seen as the work of a malicious curse. And then, just as mysteriously as it appeared, it began to fade. The Enlightenment's gold light of reason, championed by thinkers like Descartes, cast out the old shadows of humoral theory. The new science, with its focus on anatomy and physiology, left no room for a man made of glass. The body was now seen as a machine, and the mind as a separate, thinking entity. The delusion lost its intellectual and cultural footing. It became a relic, a fossil of a pre-scientific age, its sufferers moving from the palace to the asylum. The final irony, of course, is that the glass delusion itself proved to be as fragile as the bodies it imagined. It was a collective fantasy, a shared story that a particular culture told itself for a few centuries. When the culture changed, the story shattered. It broke apart and was swept away by the winds of modernity, leaving only faint, glittering shards behind in old books and medical texts. And perhaps the most enduring debate among all the historians, physicians, and philosophers who have studied this phenomenon is what it ultimately says about us. Is the glass delusion proof of how irrational and suggestible the human mind can be, or is it a testament to its creativity? Academics still argue whether we should view it as a failure of reason or as a powerful, poetic metaphor for a very real and timeless kind of suffering. There is no easy answer. It was both. It was a bizarre, illogical, and deeply human response to the universal feelings of anxiety, vulnerability, and the profound mystery of living inside a fragile, mortal body. Looking back, the entire episode feels like a dream-along, collective hallucination that held a small part of the world in its thrall and then quietly dissolved with the morning light of a new era. It's a story that reminds us that reality is sometimes a more fragile thing than we think. It can be bent, twisted, and even remade by the strange alchemy of the human mind. The men of glass may be long gone, but their story serves as a quiet, crystalline reminder of a time when the line between the mind and the material world was so thin, you could almost see right through it. And so, the story of the glass men comes to a close. The lights in the palace have long since been extinguished. The alchemist's fires have cooled to embers, and the anxious whispers in the halls have faded into silence. The world that created this strange and fragile fear has dissolved back into the mists of time, leaving only these echoes for us to ponder. As our journey ends, perhaps you can feel the world around you beginning to soften at the edges, the sharp lines of the day blurring into the gentle contours of a dream. The weight of your own body, so solid and real, might feel a little lighter now, a little more buoyant as you drift. Let the silence that follows the story be a comfortable one, a quiet space for your mind to wander where it will. There are no more fragile kings to worry about, no more shattering fears to confront. There is only the soft, steady rhythm of your own breathing, a quiet anchor in the peaceful darkness. The story is over. And now, the night is yours. The end of the article. Good night.